What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and welcome back for another episode of the Doug Polk Podcast. We are back with today's exciting conclusion. Who is the best poker player of all time? The final 20 candidates, all ranked, and we also got a lot of pro opinions, who they thought was the best. We have some interesting top five, some interesting top picks. Looking forward to getting into that with you guys. And of course, we're going to go through and look at everything that you guys decided, how you voted, and ranked our top 20. All of that on today's exciting conclusion. Before we jump into that, couple items we got to get to. Next week, the podcast is joined by Gary Blackwood, Upswing coach, hopping on, plenty to talk about in the poker realm. Looking forward to that conversation with Gazzy B. And then also, if you guys have not caught up to speed, who's in the top 20? We talked about the top 20 last week. You can check out parts 1 and 2 of this podcast, breaking down all of the players that ended up making that list. One last thing before we get into today's podcast, I want to let everyone know the Lodge is going to be having its Lodge Championship Series. This is the flagship event, the flagship series for the Lodge here in Austin, Texas. Come on down. We have over $5 million guaranteed. Well, actually, it's $5 million guaranteed, but I bet you we're going to break that, including a $3,000 main event. It might be 3,300, 33,000, something like that. Another great ad read from me. And that's $2 million guaranteed in that one. Should be a great tournament. I got lots of people coming down here already. You do not want to miss the flagship championship series from the Lodge. Guys, what do you think? My ad reads today. Good, bad, same?
On point, as usual.
My favorite
totally on point, Doug.
My favorite was when I clicked a still image and thought it was a clip. That was just great stuff.
Well, luckily the audio listeners will not know that happened, except for that we just talked about it. Well, anyway, I'm very excited to be here. I cannot wait to reveal some of these pro votes, like how certain pros rank their top 5. It is just fantastic.
Absolutely the case. We asked a series of different pros that you guys probably know. Someone's mic, by the way, is getting a lot of feedback. Not sure what's going on with that.
Kane, I think. Yeah, I think Kane, when you're not talking, it gets a little...
Yeah, maybe just mute it when you're not talking would be good, yeah. So anyway, so we asked a lot of other top well-known pros what they thought the top 5 should be, to get some more opinions, to get some more lists in here, and sort of round out maybe just our perspectives, a little bit like how last week Kane talked to a poker historian about some of the games back in the day. I thought that was a nice touch for the last podcast. Talk about Chip Reese, talk about Stu Unger, talk about some of these older guys. Well, by talking to some of these other pros, we get some opinions that can help us refine our own opinions about certain players. Like when Kane talked about Chip Reese versus Stu Unger, I definitely learned some things about that I wouldn't have known otherwise. I think that the names that you'll see here shortly, their top 5s will give us some good insight, and also plenty to debate, and some certainly some interesting ones as well. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it then here, guys. Let's kick it off. We're going to start off with our first list from Jason Koon. Now, I want to talk about Jason Koon for a second here, because Jason Koon, we discussed it a little bit, and he really didn't want to say top 5 specifically because he felt like it was impossible. He mentioned a series of names that were sort of came to the top of his list. These were all kind of in the conversation for top 5. Now, I would say no one too surprising here. Obviously, we see Ben Solsky, Sauce makes his top 5 conversation. True Teller in there as well as some of these other names. Kane, what are your thoughts on this list?
Yeah, I see a lot of overlaps between this list and my list. We're going to see, I think, it's going to be interesting to see if we notice a pattern here with Doyle Brunson and Chip Reese, some of the old school guys, how many people have Doyle and Chip on their top 5 list. I also do think it's interesting, Jason Koon giving a nod to some of the online goats, right? We got Tollerine on there. We got Solsky on there. We got True Teller, Haxton, and obviously Ivy, who's the biggest winner online of all time.
Certainly the case.
I think how hesitant Jason was to actually rank players and put one above the other, it goes to show just how impossible of a question this really is, right? I mean, Jason's played with a lot of these guys, and the ones he hasn't played with, he's probably much more familiar with than we are, because he's I'm sure he's talked a lot with people who have played with Chip Reese. He's probably heard a lot about Chip Reese, and for sure he knows a ton about the games of Phil Ivey, Ben Solsky, True Teller, Ike, Ben Tollerine. He's played with all of them quite extensively and talked strategy with several of them quite extensively, and he still just couldn't bring himself to, make this guy number one, this guy number two. It just goes to show like how difficult this question is. Luckily, we have so many different people's opinions, not just the voters, also these roughly 11 to 15 pros that we're going to run through their lists. So, I think we'll get a good idea. We're going to spot some interesting trends today. And yeah, what are your thoughts on this list?
I think that Solsky and Ben Tollerine should be in parentheses, right? I don't think they were in the fan top 20. They just barely missed the fan top 20, which is interesting that 3 of these 7 names were not in the fan vote for top 20 from this list. Something to note about Koon's list that I'm just kind of picking up on here. It seems like among the different factors that we discussed, longevity, variety of game types, variety of mediums between live and online. It seems like Jason Koon, to me, just taking a look at this list, has really concentrated on dominance. He has names here of guys who were just kind of at the top of X game or Y game for a number of years. A great example of that would be Tollerine and Solsky, right? Solsky's a guy who, or Tollerine are guys who don't necessarily have the variety. Solsky hasn't really played as much live, for example, right? Tollerine, from my understanding, does not play mixed games, right? But these are guys who were just at the very top in their respective games during their time.
Kane, can you turn up your mic slightly? I think it's maybe a bit too quiet. Some people in the chat were saying that as well.
I got him, Doug. I got it.
Oh, you got him? Okay, Brady got you. Then that you should be fine then. Yeah, I see that as well, Kane. These are definitely names that duked it out at sort of the top of their era, depending on or when that was and where that was. I thought a lot about the older players when I was making my own top 5 list, and I realized something, and this is just for me personally. Obviously, it's going to vary from person to person, but I think that just the level of play and the maybe not level of play so much as the level of competition of the players back in the day, it just makes it very tough for me to want to rank players from before in the top 5. And I think if I was going to rank a player from that era in the top 5, I didn't on my list. I think if I was going to, I would need to have seen them just be absolutely dominant. All forms, tournaments, cash games, everyone knows that they're the man. I would need to see a level of dominance that I just don't feel like I saw from anyone of that era. I know Chip Reese was very good, and people say that he was on top of his game, and he was one of the toughest players at the table. I know Doyle has been winning money for many years in poker, but I just don't feel like I saw a level of dominance from anyone in the older generation that would lead me towards wanting to have them be in my top 5. But again, this is a conversation, right? These players are in the conversation, and they certainly are in the conversation for that.
Yeah, and one thing I want to touch on while we're on this first slide, and I think we're going to spend a little extra time on Jason Koon's just while we kind of set up this whole rest of the pod. Kane had a great tweet earlier this week where he sort of laid out the different factors to consider when deciding on who is the greatest of all time poker player. And I kind of just want to run through those really quick. So dominance, which is one that Kane touched on already. Results, like, number of bracelets won, tournaments won, dollars. Versatility of games, so being good at mixed games and a wide variety of different types of poker games. Versatility of formats, so tournaments versus cash and short stack versus deep stack, etc. Versatility of medium, live, online, and then the ability to beat various types of lineups for high win rates. And there's sort of one other thing that I want to throw out there, which is how feared the player is among the good players, like how little other people want to see that guy at their table. A great example is Phil Ivey in 2007, right? No one wanted Phil Ivey at their table in 2007. Similarly, right now, I don't think anyone wants True Teller at their table. So those are kind of the factors that are going to be a consistent theme throughout this podcast, because those are really what the main things to consider.
Yeah. And I think, as I noted, it seems like Koon really paid attention to the dominance, right? Who was able to compete against the top pros during their era. But there's another way, I think, to dominate at the poker table, which is who's able to dominate amateurs the best. I think that Koon concentrated a little bit less on that, right? We're missing names here like Helmuth and Negreanu, or guys who have just had a lot of success in kind of weaker field, either tournaments or cash games. And I think that Koon really concentrated on the guys who are just kind of at the top of their game against other top pros during their era. One thing I should say a real fast, because we want to, throughout this entire process, we always want to, if we say something wrong, correct ourselves. Last time on the podcast, we were talking about Koon, and I said, he's a good short deck player, but I'm not sure if he ever became one of the best. Koon actually did become one of the best short deck players. I did a little research between the pods and figured that out. Koon was, a top 3, if not number 1 short deck player for some period of time. And so it's great to have somebody with Jason Koon's poker mind weigh in on this. And it's an interesting starting point.
Absolutely correct on all points there, Ken. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide here. Oh, you got it. I got it. All right, we're good. Zack, top poker players list. We have Phil Ivey number 1, Doyle number 2, Chip Reese number 3, Ben Solsky number 4, David Oppenheim number 5, Isaac Haxton number 6, and Phil Galfond number 7. Mike, what jumps out at you about Zack's list?
Well, the thing that jumps out, maybe it's not the most notable thing, but the thing that jumps out most to me is just the first appearance of David Oppenheim on the list. I don't know too much about him. Really, my only exposure to David Oppenheim is the fact that he was a full tilt red pro with his own custom avatar back in the day. And then he was on Poker After Dark like one time. And I remember he was in this game with like Phil Ivey, Tom Dwan, etc. And he was doing the interview at the side of the table with the host or whatever. And he referred to like the group who was playing and himself as part of it as top pros. And at the time, I didn't really know much about him. So I noticed like, who is this guy comparing himself to like these other crushers? And it turns out, absolutely a crusher himself. I think mainly a mixed game player. Kane, can you speak much to that?
David Oppenheim is mainly a mixed game player and mainly a cash player. I actually spoke to Zack about his list, and he told me that in his opinion, David Oppenheim should be on every single player's top 10 list. And his reasoning was that he believes that David Oppenheim in the modern era has won the most money in public cash games, period. The only player who may have won more in the modern era is Phil Ivey. He thinks that among all players of all time, David Oppenheim has probably won the 4th most money in public cash games, if he had to guess, after Brunson, Reese, and Ivey. And it actually is kind of interesting to talk about it in those terms, Doug, because it goes back to what you were saying before. Doug said somebody would really have to have a lot of dominance from the old era in order to make the top of this list. If we knew, and a lot of people believe, that Brunson has won the most money in public cash games in the history of poker, and that Reese is number 2, that's a pretty big statement, right? That's we obviously don't have that data, but if that were true, Doug, if you knew that to be a fact, that Doyle Brunson won the most money in the history of live public cash games, and Chip Reese won the 2nd most, would they then crack your top 5?
Yeah, I think likely to be the case. I don't put as much emphasis on pure winning money, or else I would have Bilzerian in my top 10. And I don't think anyone did that. So clearly there's some degree of, we're not going to just value people beating weak players in private games. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily clear cut, but it would definitely be a strong motivating factor towards putting them in the top 10 or top 5. I want to talk about OP for a second here, David Oppenheim, because I had a conversation yesterday with a player that I respect a lot that plays in a lot of the high stakes private games, has played all over the place, Vegas, Macau, a lot of the highest stakes stuff. And I was getting some real great insight into a lot of these games, a lot of these players. And the Oppenheim thing is really confusing to me, because they also mirrored some of the sentiment about Oppenheim and about how great he is and how he is potentially one of the best players in the world. And it's so jarring compared to my experience with David Oppenheim, because I played against David Oppenheim, let's say six years ago. I went to Vegas and I played some 3K, 6K heads up 8 game in Bobby's room. I played a few different guys, and one of them was David Oppenheim. And when I started to play him, I realized that he was a fish. He was actually a fish. He didn't know about pre-flop. He didn't know about post-flop. He was folding tons of buttons in PLO. He was throwing cards. He was yelling at the dealer. He was demanding new setups. And I realized that I had an actual fish at my table. It was just a straight up fish. And I won about $500,000 off of him. And then he quit me. And he told me that he was busy. He was busy. One day I walk into Bobby's room months later. He says, "Doug, decided to show your face again, huh, kid?" I'm floored, confused. I don't know if he's being cool in front of his friends. And I say, Opie, we can play. Let's play. He's like, oh, I got a game right now. We'll play though. Nice to show your face again around here. And then I text him, hey, I'm free all week. He's like, oh, I'm busy. I'm not playing this week. Next week, same thing. No game. So my experience with Oppenheim is he's a fish. He's kind of a liar. He throws things at dealers and he complains all the time. And then I've got top 5 best player ever. Really? So I guess it shows you a little bit about intersections of where you run into people. And so in my opinion, from what I saw of Opie, I would say that he is a fish. But apparently, for some people, top 5 ever. So, and there were some people I really respected that put him in their top 5. So I know these people are trying. They're making their best list. They really think he's a top player. It just kind of shows how when you run into people can matter a lot.
So I think that most people would agree that David Oppenheim would not be in their top 5 or 10 people they want to hang out with, or top 5 or 10 most ethical or poker personalities they want to be around. But what I will say that David Oppenheim's primary skill is, it probably doesn't really translate to playing Doug Polk heads up, and that is that he might have, from what I've heard, I've only played with him a couple times, so I can't speak to this personally, but from what I've heard, he might have the best live reads in poker, period, perhaps of all time. So Dan Zack told me about a situation where they were playing deuce to 7 single draw, right, which is supposedly the game that has the most to do with live reads. And in one rotation, David Oppenheim opened the cutoff, button 3 bets, back over to Oppenheim, he calls, right, and Oppenheim catches at a 10. I think both players draw 1. It goes check, and he just folds, right, which is a very tight fold, right, to Doug's point. He's not playing fundamentally sound. Literally the next rotation, it's exactly the same action, right? Oppenheim catches a pair of 5s and calls the same bet in the exact same situation and is right. And he was right to fold the 10 as well. So maybe, Doug, you weren't giving off much live tells heads up. Obviously, when you're playing heads up, like, you're very kind of clued in. You're trying not to give off live tells, where all of a sudden you put people in a 6-handed environment. They're on their cell phone. They're drinking having a sandwich, to quote Negreanu. They're doing whatever, right? David Oppenheim will pick up on the fact that you're just acting differently, feeling differently, have a different vibe about yourself, and he's going to make money in spots where other people aren't.
I'm going to have to push back on that example a little bit, although the point is still a good one, because in triple draw, in those situations when you're D1 versus D1, a lot of times it's about card removal and not about absolute value. And so if you both draw 1 in single draw and you check on after the draw, then they're going to certainly be value betting anything better than a 10, and they're not going to be value betting a jack. So if you have a really rough 10, or you have a bad, let's say you have something that's like a 10-8-7, you just have a relatively poor 10, then you actually don't beat any of their value range. And if you do pair with a hand like a pair of 5s, people aren't going to bluff with a pair of deuces or 3s or 4s because they have worse hands in their range when they D1 that can bluff. So if let's say that they drew at 9, 7, 6, 4 deuce, they're not going to bluff with a pair of 2s there, because if you paired higher, they win. They're not going to bluff with a pair of 4s there, because if you paired higher, they win. So based on the removal attributes of those 2 hands, it can actually be theoretically correct to be calling with the pair of 5s and folding with the 10. They're probably both folds, but I'm just saying there could be. I haven't thought about that the intricacies of a cutoff button range and the way that people are bluffing.
I think that the 10 is a pretty clear call.
Well, it depends on what kind of 10, right?
I have to say, I did not expect us to get this deep into the weeds of deuce to 7 single draw strategy in this podcast. I'm here for it, but wow, a surprising development.
A jack could sometimes be a value bet. So, like, if you're ahead of some of his value range, then a 10 would just be the most standard call in that situation. I think you would have to have a specific read to want to fold. I don't know how strong his 10 was. But I think you'd have to have a specific read to want to fold a.
Okay. So you're saying, yeah, it still is a big fold. I just, it's a big bet. It's a big bet game, and removal plays a big role. So,
well, what I find to be interesting is that Oppenheim, especially among mixed players, right, was on the top 5 or top 10 of a lot of these guys. Doug, you didn't have him. You didn't even put him in your top 100 for people. People couldn't even vote on David Oppenheim if they wanted to.
If you had asked me, is David Oppenheim a fish? I would have said yes. I mean a fish. Actually, someone that can't win at poker, yells at dealers, needs new setups, throws things.
Well, maybe
what do we got going on here, guys?
Maybe
this is fish behavior.
Maybe Oppenheim will be listening to this podcast, and it's possible you guys will get back in the ring over at Bobby's room playing high stakes mix. Would you?
Well,
be
not
down,
anymore. He's top 5 all time. I need to save my challenges for softer spots like Tom Dwan. All right, let's move on to the next list here. See what we got going. Mike, you got this one. I won't mess with it. All right, down to Negreanu's top poker players. He ranks Phil Ivey number 1, Chip Reese number 2, Doyle Brunson number 3, David Oppenheim number 4, himself number 5, and Patrick Antonius number 6. Kane, thoughts on Negreanu's list?
Yeah, I mean, this list definitely makes sense. You can see Negreanu really giving a nod to some of the older school guys. I don't see anybody younger than 40 on this list, right? I think Negreanu, it kind of speaks to his experience, right? He's really interested here in public live results, in live tournament results. He does have the 2 biggest online winners, right? But they're the old school online guys, which are Patrick and Phil Ivey. And I think he's kind of missed some of the newer online guys, some of the guys specifically who are good at heads up in the big bet forms of poker, right? He's missed Ike, Cates, which appear on a lot of other people's lists. Sauce and Ben Tollerine that we saw on Jason Koon's list. What do you think, Doug?
He's definitely leaning towards players that were more of his era or slightly before. And I do think that that's a bias that many players are going to have, myself included, because when you enter poker and you're on the rise, you're coming up, the people that you look up to just seem so much greater at the game. And then once you've gotten to sort of the pinnacle, which Daniel's been at for a long time, then the people that you're not checking who's beating 5, 10, 10, 20, 20, 20, 50 on Poker Stars. You're not seeing who's doing well in small stakes tournament scene. You're not seeing what mixed game player is really making the rounds in the 40-80. You're just seeing things from that top landscape. And so there's really no way for players that are newer to ever eclipse the image that you have of some of these people that were at the top of the game when you came through. And I think we see a little bit of that here with Daniel's list. Nothing here is that crazy other than Oppenheim. I think that one, I'm not saying because I think he's bad, guys. I'm just saying that would be that's quite the zag compared to what most people view as a top in their top 5. But the rest of these are certainly standard, right? Phil Ivey number 1. I think a lot of people are going to have Phil Ivey number 1. And Phil, the thing about Phil, just to touch on Phil Ivey for a moment, the reason why he's such a strong candidate for number 1 is because he just has a proven track record of winning in so many games. Number 1 ever online, great tournament resume, played in all of these high stakes games that we can see. He's played in all of the private Macau games. He plays all the mixed games. He plays basically everything. And anytime that we get a glimpse as to how he's done in it, we know that he's won. So that just makes him a very, very strong candidate for number 1 when you consider the amount of time that he was able to do this for. Now, if this list was who is the best player in 2021, Ivey is nowhere close to the top 10. If it was in the last 5 years, still nowhere close to the top 10. But if we look at the overall career and the consistency of being in that top echelon, I think Ivey is a pretty easy choice for number 1. What do you guys think about Ivey as the number 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super reasonable. I was talking to Chris Kruk, who's a great player himself, about Ivey in general, and he was saying that, to quote him basically directly, he's the only player to just look at me live and know I'm bluffing, tell me I'm bluffing, and then just pick me off with napkins all in one hand. And I've heard a lot of stories about Ivey that are very similar to that. I mean, I don't think I've played with Ivey for more than a hand or 2 in a tournament myself, but so I haven't had that experience. But I mean, he picked you off once, Doug, in a pretty good spot.
Thanks,
to pick
Mike.
someone off. Hey, nothing wrong with that. At least you bluff, Doug. And it just makes sense that he's going to hit the top of these lists. One quick thing I wanted to mention for our visual, for the people watching right now, audio listeners, this isn't relevant to you, but on these slides you're seeing, if they're in parentheses, that means they didn't make the fan-voted top 20, but this person wanted to include them on their list. So if they're not in parentheses, it means they were in the fan-voted top 20. If they're in parentheses, they did not make it, but the person wanted to include them.
Yeah. Here's my question about Ivy, Doug. Do you think that, because we've spoken about his versatility, right? But what about his dominance? Do you think that in any era there was a player who was more feared than Ivy to play? If you said you had to play against this player in even the most popular games of the time, No Limit Hold'em, Pot Limit Omaha, right? Or back in the day, it would be Stud, depending on how far back we go, 5-card draw, right? Do you think that Chip Reese at the top of his career was as feared as Ivy? Do you think that Sauce was as feared as Ivy? Do you think that Linus today is as feared as Ivy?
In their respective game type or in a variety of games?
In a variety of games.
In a variety of games, I think at peak, Phil Ivey was probably the most. I think he would have been the top, the player that the most players did not want to see at the table in a variety of games. I think there have been instances where in specific games, people would be more scared of someone. I think that if you ask someone during the peak of OTB Red Baron's time playing, would I rather play with OTB Red Baron versus those people versus people that played cash games with Ivy in 2007? I think the OTB Red Baron people would be more upset to have OTB there, or the Linus people in the last few years. I think that in heads-up formats, people have never been that afraid of Phil Ivey, and there certainly are heads-up opponents that people are more feared. So, I mean, I went a year without getting action, guys, basically because no one would play me. So, was I more feared in heads-up no limit than Ivy in general? I think so, but am I more feared in a variety of games? Definitely not. Most of my games I played, people told me I was terrible at tournaments, mixed games, definitely PLO. So across the board, I would say Ivy is the most feared poker player of all time.
Yeah, especially because of the wide variety of people who are feared by him, right? Like using you as an example, you were the most feared at Heads Up online, but if you just pick like a random poker type person, maybe like a guy in a 2-5 game in a random casino, he wouldn't have been afraid of WCG Ryder back in 2014, right? But he certainly would be afraid of Phil Ivey. I don't know how much that matters, but just the wide net that Ivy's fear casts over the poker world is definitely notable.
Yeah, something that was really interesting to me online at like right before Black Friday is Ivy was basically still willing to play just about anybody heads up, right? He kind of concentrated his time on the mixed games, right? But even then, I was, obviously friendly with the online crew, and everybody thought that they had a way to beat Ivy. Oh, well, he's not very good short. And, well, he makes these mistakes heads up. And, well, if you play him at X, Y, or Z game or whatever. But they wouldn't really, if they did win from him, it wasn't very much, And so it's amazing that Ivy was competitive against the online guys back in the day, right? I say back in the day. For Ivy, it wasn't back in the day, but before Black Friday. Whereas a guy like Tom Dwan, for example, who we haven't seen on the top of anybody's list, right, was considered to be one of the best, but the guys who actually played him heads up actually had more decisive, higher win rates against Tom Dwan than they did against Phil Ivey, right? We're talking about the best online players at the time were able to exploit Tom Dwan much more easily than Phil Ivey.
I would actually push back a little bit here, and I would say that I think that Tom Dwan was more likely to play anyone than Ivy. Ivy's played a lot of people. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that he's some ridiculous bum hunter or something, but Ivy always did pick his spots fairly well. And he made sure that he was the best player in the game, and he picked games that he was good at, which is what you should do. That's not a knock. That's how you become a good poker player. You pick games you win at, and you beat people at them. So that's not. I'm just saying. I think in terms of game selection, I would not say that he was just taking on all comers the whole time. I think a lot of people I think that people at the absolute top of different games weren't afraid of Ivy even around his peak, but they would have been afraid of Ivy in 9 out of the 10 games he would be willing to play in. You know what I'm saying? So he just wasn't as much a specialist, I think.
I do remember him battling some people where it was going to be tough for him to have I think he was playing Scubba heads up, no limit cap for some period of time. He was same with R. Questmara, who is one of the,
Scubba.
Yeah.
You know Scubba these days?
No.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, I still know Scubba. Chat every now and then.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
It's also notable about Daniel's list is the first time we're seeing Patrick make an appearance on the list. And it's interesting to talk about Patrick right after talking about Ivy, right? Because basically, to me, these two players are very similar in a lot of ways. And it's just that Patrick is like not quite at Ivy's level, right? But they were good at all the same stuff. If you look at the biggest winner in the history of online was Phil Ivey, second is Patrick. And he's actually not too far behind if you look at both his winnings under Patrick Antonius and under Findegrind. So we're talking about guys who were just completely crushing online poker back in the day, who could play every game, every format of poker, who were the most feared opponents in the world, right? And who recently have not really completely stayed up. Talking about longevity, have not completely stayed up with the game. I've kind of fallen off a little bit in the solver era. But it's just like Patrick is always a step behind Ivy. And I think that's why we're seeing Ivy at the top of everybody's list and Patrick making his first appearance on Daniel's list. And I think it absolutely makes sense to talk about Patrick as one of the best players of all time. I mean, you're talking about the second biggest winner in the history of online poker. You're talking about somebody who, during that whole period where Ivy was the most feared player at the table, who is the second most feared player you can have in a variety of game types? It was probably Patrick.
Yeah, I have one last thought on Daniel's list before we move on. And I would be very interested to see Daniel flesh out this list to like 20 or 30, because I'd be curious where the more online newer school guys start to crack the list. Like, I wonder if he has, just to pull a random name like a Linus or whatever at number like 12 or something like that. I'd be very curious to see when he starts mixing in those newer school guys.
I don't think he has a Linus at 12. Sorry to break it to you, Brady. I don't think he has a Linus at 12.
That was a very bad example. Very, very bad example.
Yeah, right, I agree with both of you.
All right, so anyway, let's move on to another Daniel. This one's got a little more lulls. Daniel Cates is top poker players. Number 1, Daniel Cates, quote unquote, Ob. Number 2, Phil Ivey. Number 3, True Teller, Timofey Kuznetsov. Number 4, Isaac Haxton. Number 5, Matthew Ashton. Doug, initial thoughts on Jungleman's list here?
I do enjoy putting yourself at number 1, especially with the Ov. I think that really adds a little bit of flexing on top there. I like his list a lot. I think the Matthew Ashton pick is one. I didn't make it, but I think it was a reasonable one. A lot of people had really good things to say about his game. I didn't really meet him in my path in poker at any point, but just time and time again, I think Matthew Ashton has one of the best responses from people I've talked to about his game that have played with him, right? So under the radar, but when people have played with him, good, very, very good. And even then, he wasn't that under the radar. He won the 50K Players Championship in Vegas one year, but consistently, people seem to have him very highly rated. The rest of his list is reasonable. I definitely think that Jungle has a reasonable claim as one of the top players ever. He's played, so a bunch of reasons here. The case for Daniel Cates. First off, he's played an incredible amount of poker. I think since he's turned old enough to play poker, he's been full-time the entire time, loves the game, loves playing, constantly playing, always looking for new games. So just the volume of play, he's on track to be in the same category as these older guys that have played their whole lives. So I would say volume certainly there. Ferocity, in every game he played, he was at least tough, if not just very good. And I think some people, when he started playing live, thought he had a bunch of tells, and he probably did. And I think that when he played online in games that he wasn't familiar with, some 6max formats, things like that, he wasn't as good at first. People thought he was a spot, but would consistently would improve, would always be learning, has incredible natural instincts for the game. Maybe the number 1 player ever in just instincts, probably number 1. I don't know who I would put over Jungle and just their instincts in a spot they've never seen before. What's correct, what's not right. He's not afraid to relentlessly fire in all spots. He doesn't just have the spots he likes to bluff. He tries to be balanced in all of them. He's scary to bluff. he's scary to fold against. And of course, this is very biased because I'm down 40 buy-ins to Jungle Lifetime, and that's obviously playing a big role in why I think that he's as good as he is. But a lot of reasons why I think Jungle is an absolute top-notch player. The drawbacks a bit on Jungle are a little bit more the live read component or live tell component. Not really that great in live tournaments, despite having played a small chunk of them. But I certainly think that it's reasonable to put himself up there, and he's rocking it with confidence.
So it's interesting to look at Daniel Cates' list right after looking at Negreanu's, because it's kind of the opposite. Daniel Cates is distinctly missing Doyle and Reese, right? So Daniel Cates giving a nod to the new school guys, the guys of his era, whereas Negreanu was giving a nod to some of the older school guys. Talking about Cates being number one of all time, I actually think Cates has a reasonable claim to that. And the reason why, the thing we didn't even talk about with Cates, because he still is young, right? But his longevity has been insane. Basically, from the time he was old enough to play online poker, he very quickly he was a good reg, right? And then very quickly, within 1 or 2 years, came to the top, where he was beating Tom Dwan in the Dur Challenge. And even today, he's at the top. So throughout that whole period, right, Dan Cates has been one of the best. We just don't see that. You don't see that with guys like Sauce, who were at the top for a couple years, would play anybody heads up, and now they're not really at the top anymore. With guys like Ben Tollerine, right? These guys tend to stay at the top for a couple of years and then come in and out. That's not the case with Cates. Cates is about to, he's throwing down the gauntlet against Phil Galfond in the Galfond Challenge pretty soon. He's still considered one of the best heads-up players in the world at the big bet game types. But all of a sudden, you throw in mixed games. Who's going to play Jungleman today? Who's going to play Jungleman heads-up in every single form of poker? I don't think maybe Matt Ashton. I don't know. Not many people want to take on that challenge. The one place I will disagree with you, Doug, and this is my biggest actually knock on Cates, is I think differently about this than you do, is that I don't think Dan Cates' natural poker talent is as high as the other people on this list. To me, Dan Cates is somebody who, when he first picks up a new game, and we've seen this before, he's just not very good. In fact, if we had to come up with a list of people we didn't want to play picking up a new game in big bet, I think that that True Teller, right, is very, very high on my list. Daniel Cates tends to play too many hands. He tends to play too aggressive, especially in ring. I watched Daniel in the early days when he was playing 9-handed no limit for the first time, and I would literally hunt him in the 9-handed no limit table, even at a table of all regs and Daniel Cates. It didn't happen that often, but when it did and he was just learning that game, he was like VPipping 35%. But then what Cates will do is really study the game. He'll solve the game. And once he has those solutions, he becomes very, very good and very competitive at the game.
I want to change what I said slightly. I want to change the word instincts, and I want to replace it with hand reading. I think that he has the best hand reading of any player I've ever seen in my entire life. Instincts is incorrect because I would agree with you. He plays too loose in a lot of these formats, and he has to figure things out. Definitely a player nowadays that learns from the solvers in the solver era, but even before the solver era, he had to learn by playing. I don't think he has to find solutions in the way that you're describing. I think by playing, he picks up the answers closer to optimal based on what he sees people doing, based on what he sees works and doesn't work. He's got great pattern recognition, but I think hand reading is really what I meant. So I would agree with you overall, Kane.
So yeah, my biggest knock on Jungle would be in the same way that we're saying that the guys like Ivy and Antonius haven't really kept up in the solver era. I don't think that Daniel Cates, in my opinion, would be a top poker player outside of the solver era. Although he did become the best heads-up player in the world before solvers really existed.
That's a pretty strong counter argument, Kane. Which side are you on here?
Well, that was no limit hold'em, right? And now we're talking about him being good at basically every form of poker.
Yeah, but these other formats don't use solvers nearly as much. They're not as widely available, and he probably doesn't even have solvers for most of these. So, I mean, there's some games, sure, but most of them don't. If he became the number one heads-up no limit player in the world pre-solvers, I feel like we can't say that he's a product of the solver era, can we?
would he have become the heads up, the number one heads up no limit player in the world without hand histories, without any data? That's the question.
I would argue yes, because I'm not sure how much studying jungle was doing back then anyway. And sort of regardless, if you want to say that he's a product of the hand history era, maybe that's closer to accurate, but we can't say solver era, being that he came up before the solvers.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to bring up about Dan Cates is I was trying to find an image of it that we could pop up, but it seems lost to time. But his poker table ratings graph back in the day, for those who are newer to poker, it was basically like a database of public results from all stakes on Full Tilt and Stars. And the speed at which he went from a graph that he was clearly playing like 50 NL heads up, roughly, maybe even like 25 NL heads up, to like within a year or so, he was playing 10K NL heads up, 50, 100, and maybe even higher. The way it was one of those graphs where the beginning of it looks completely insignificant, but it's actually like hundreds of thousands of hands. And then by the end of the graph, it goes parabolic because he's playing so much higher stakes than he was at the beginning, like 100-fold in some cases. So I think the speed at which he got better at that game, and granted, it was because he got a ton of reps in. He played millions of hands, right? I think he really did work his way to that point. I don't think he was, I mean, he'd have to answer himself, but I don't think he was like studying hands. He was super in the lab in between. I think he was trial and error, trial by fire, playing hands at 50 NL, playing hands at 100 NL, playing the best regs, continuously getting better, and then eventually reaching the highest stakes, which is super impressive. You could argue heads up is, you know, one of the more conducive game types for that sort of rise, because you're playing against one opponent. It's a little bit more static in the things you
Edges
learn.
are higher.
Yeah, for sure. But it's outrageously impressive nonetheless. And if anyone can find that graph, please tweet it at us, because I would love to see it and share it.
Yeah, we also mentioned how Ivy's number one in online earnings, how Patrick is number two, Dan Cates is number three, which is a very important point. And finally, you know, we talked about earlier, is this guy somebody who is able to compete at the very top level against other top pros, or is he also able to exploit weaker players? We talked about it in the circumstance of large field tournaments, but I think Daniel Cates is a really interesting example of somebody. This is what I think Dan Cates is the best in the world at: figuring out what his opponent is doing wrong and just relentlessly taking advantage of it. So Daniel Cates would take people who actually weren't fish, right? They weren't even close to being fish. They were good regs, and he would make them a fish, because he would figure out the one or two or three things that they did wrong, right? And he would just relentlessly exploit them. Whereas other players would say, well, you know, I want to stay a little bit balanced here, or maybe my opponent will adjust. Dan Cates' thing was, no. I'm going to keep doing it until they adjust. And I'm just going to continue in every single spot to take advantage of them in that way. Doug, I think you have a little bit of that as well, but is that something that you picked up on when you were playing Daniel?
Definitely. Daniel, when you play versus jungle, you'll have hands that are only possible versus jungle, where he'll just get so dialed in on you that you end up in this weird sort of meta game where you both know a thing, and then the hands that can get played after that are kind of incredible. I remember a hand when I was watching the the Dur challenge. Definitely wasn't the jungle challenge. The Dur challenge from back in the day, where it went open call and the flop was 8-4 deuce, and they were 130 blinds deep or something. And the action went check, bet, raise, jam, fold, and jungle just shows ace deuce. And I don't know what his logic was there, but clearly he just knew this is never a good hand. So I'm just going to town with my ace deuce here. He showed the hand afterwards, obviously, for the max pain. So when you play jungle, there's chances that you have hands where if I bluffed and won when the guy called, or hero called and lost, they're both most likely versus jungle, because he's definitely able to break away from traditional hand selection. If he thinks that it's the right play, he'll go for the right play regardless.
All right, well, we've said a lot about Dan Cates. So I think we're good to move on, yeah? Unless you guys want to talk about Matt Ashton at all. Great mixed game player. We haven't really touched on him yet.
I think we did already talk. I think we haven't talked much about Timofey Kuznetsov, otherwise known as True Teller. I think that's the one that we got to at least talk about a little bit before we move on. So True Teller, we talked about this a bit in the last podcast, but Trueteller is certainly one of the best cap players ever, maybe the best cap player ever. Also a very successful online 6-max cash player in both the short formats and in the ring formats. Also a good heads up no limit player at both cap or deeper formats. Certainly good at ante stuff. He's played almost no tournaments, but he's cashed for millions of dollars in the live tournament scene. He's very good at live high stakes cash. He's basically good at all of the things. And then he's also played a lot of mixed games. He had a big heads up crossbook thing with Phil Ivey where he won big. He's played a lot of the mixed games as well. This guy is an absolute stone crusher at pretty much every game that he's ever played. And I would say that he's much more disciplined and sharp at the intricacies of small edges than some of the other players on the list. When Trueteller realizes that there's a 0.2 edge somewhere, he goes for the 0.2 edge. And if he thinks it's negative 0.1, he doesn't play the hand. So he's someone that's way more in tune with just small edges. And that probably comes from a cap background where he's used to playing in games where you need those really tiny edges to build your win rate. Yet he's able to seemingly learn any game in the world and play at a top-notch level.
The mixed games that Trueteller plays, Doug, are they big bet mixed games? Because I think Trueteller is the best in the world at like the big bet forms of stud and triple draw big bet and that sort of thing. I think there's some consensus there that if there's a new big bet variant of poker based on some game that's traditionally a limit game, like Trueteller is the guy you don't want to play.
He's played both. He was playing Ivy in the traditional 8-game mix, but he's played all of them. Some more than others, of course. And I haven't been catching up with Trueteller the last few years, but as far as I understand, he's played pretty much everything. And he is basically the Ivy of today. And if he's at your table, it just can't be good. Maybe he's gotten softer over the years. Maybe it's not what he once was, but it would be interesting to see what someone like a Linus would say about a Trueteller in today's day and age.
Well, if anybody wants to play Trueteller at massive stakes, he's sitting the highest stakes games in the history of online poker right now. So, and he doesn't get too many challengers. So I do think that your point you made about him being modern day Ivy is correct. I think Trueteller's, one of the best players of all time. In my opinion, if today we invented a new form of poker and just dealt out the cards, the Trueteller is the one guy I don't want at my table. I think that he's best going to be able to figure out approximately what hands are strong pre-flop, what hands to VPIP, where to bluff. I think he's going to be able to figure out those sort of things faster than just about anybody.
Let's move on to the next slide here. Andrew. Oh, all right. I'll just let you do it, Mike. Andrew Neeme's top poker players list.
We got Phil Ivey at number 1, Doyle Brunson at number 2, Chip Reese at number 3, Stu Unger at number 4, Dale Negreanu at number 5. This is definitely a list of 5 players that you kind of expect to be on a lot of top 5 lists, I think. If you were to ask the audience to put together their top 5, I think a lot of them might be almost this exact list, if not just slightly different. We've talked a lot about a lot of these guys already. One person I think we should talk a little bit about is Stu Unger, because this is his first appearance on a top 5 list. I would have probably included Stu Unger on my top 5 list just out of almost driven by the allure of Stu Unger, how much I've heard about him over the years. But I have to say, I was convinced by Kane's argument in our podcast last week, where Kane, and feel free to correct me if I get some details wrong here, Kane, but while Stu was top notch when he was playing his A game, he unfortunately often was not. And it got to the point where there would actually be cash games running around Stu Unger. He was the proverbial fish in the game that the game existed because of. And I agreed with Kane's thought that is a disqualification for being in the top 5 poker players of all time if a game ever has ran around you.
That's a reasonable argument, and that I think is what Kane said last time. But I would say only if it's not. I think if it's your first time playing or it's one of your early times playing the game, then it's fine for a game to develop around you because you're learning. But if it's consistent, as in this is a game you play often when you're there, oh, everyone can't wait to get to your table, then yeah, that should be a disqualification.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, Doug. I mean, games have run around jungle. Mixed games have run around jungle before when he was learning. You know, games have run around just about every one of the players on this list, right? If a game has never run around you, all that says is that you're very good at game selecting and you have very good discipline, right? But for somebody to consistently be having games run around them, right? There are two names on this list that throughout their entire poker career would have really liked for Stu Ungar to be at their cash game table, right? Doyle Brunson and Chip Reese. And I think the fact that Doyle Brunson has a Mount Rushmore of poker, and there are two players on it, Puggy Pearson and Sailor, who we haven't even spoken about at all in this entire podcast, and for Stu Ungar to be somebody who the fans have voted in, who are on the initial list, and who are now is making top 5 lists. I think it's nuts. I think we need to defer to the people who played against him back in the day and really take in their consideration about how good Stu Ungar is and try to set out of our mind whatever image we have about him because we happen to like the fact that he was the first player to really use aggression in big bet tournaments, or because we think he had a really cool memory, or because he wears cool sunglasses, or whatever it is that makes us love Stu Ungar so much. Because I have the same feeling. He just has this lore about him, right? There are made-for-TV movies about him. We need to, if we're going to talk about who are the best players dispassionately, we need to put that aside, and we need to listen to the people who really played against him at the time. And overwhelmingly, they say Stu Ungar was a good tournament player. He was feared at no-limit hold'em tournaments, but then get him in a cash game, man, and that's a great spot. And I don't think you can have somebody like that in your conversation as one of the greatest poker players of all time.
What it really boils down to is that everyone loves an underdog. We love the story of the little guy that shows up outgunned back against the wall, and they come through in the clutch by maybe making some amazing reads or amazing plays or whatever it is in whatever game, and they come out on top against all odds. And Stu Ungar is an against all odds kind of story because when he ran up his bankroll, he lost his way. There were all kinds of vices in the life of Stu Ungar. And before he knew it, he was essentially broke and had to be backed back into the main event. And I think we see a little bit of ourselves in there. I know I had a pretty large fall from grace first time around when I ran up my bankroll. I'm sure many poker players have. And then we want to believe that just because your first time around, you had a huge fall and you made some mistakes, that you can still make it back if you make the right decisions, if you play well, if you bring it together. And I think when we see that main event victory where Stu Ungar overcame a lot of those things, albeit briefly, did overcome those things. We like that story, and it makes us feel like he's human, but he's still a great poker player. And the fact he could do it when he absolutely had to proves he's one of the greatest. I think that's a very compelling storyline, and that's why we see Stu Ungar on these lists. But if it is as people have been saying from that generation, and it would be great to just talk to even more people from that generation where games formed around him and he wasn't much of a cash game player, wasn't a good cash game player, and maybe there's a reason why he was broke more often than he wasn't. I don't think you can put him in the top 5.
I sincerely think that putting Stu Ungar on a list would seem to guys like Brunson, Reese, or even some of the other great players of that time who we haven't discussed, like Puggy Pearson, right? It would seem like to modern day players putting Jamie Gold on a list of best players of all time. I think it's just at its face ridiculous to these guys. I think if we had the opportunity to speak to Chip, right, or to speak to Puggy Pearson, or to speak to some of the guys who were the best players at that time, like, I just feel bad for Puggy Pearson that he didn't have a made-for-TV movie made about him, because maybe if he did, he would start to be in people's top 5 lists. I think so much of it is the lore.
Yeah, I agree. We've talked about these other guys extensively, and I think these are names that we're going to see pop up again and again. So I think we can go ahead and just move on right now to Kevin Rabichow's top poker players. I want to throw a quick caveat, for lack of a better word, out there. When I talked to Krabba and grabbed this list from him, he said, I'm like 85% confident that this list reflects my ideas. So there's 15% chance that this list does not reflect Krab's ideas. Just wanted to throw that out there. So Number 1, Doyle Brunson. Number 2, Isaac Haxton. Number 3, Ben Solsky. Number 4, Dan Cates. Number 6, Stu Unger. Number 5, Stu Unger. Number 6, True Teller. And number 7, Phil Ivey. First time we're not seeing Phil Ivey at number 1, I believe. What jumps out at you? Maybe it's that, Doug.
We saw that with Dan Cates as well. He had Dan Cates number 1.
Of course. How could I forget?
Well, a lot to talk about with this list, which is nice. Obviously, we just had the Stu Unger conversation. He's in the top 5, above True Teller, above Phil Ivey. I don't think that's something that at least myself and Kane would agree with. Probably not Mike either. I wonder what his logic was on putting Stu Unger so far ahead of some of the other people that would have been on this list. Some interesting parts about this. We have a very interesting group of people. I think with a lot of the people we saw before their lists, we saw themes, right? We saw with Dan Cates the theme of the younger generation. With the Negreanu theme, we saw older players. With Andrew, we saw more live poker and more old school live players. So we saw kind of themes with a lot of groups here. There does not seem to be much theme here whatsoever, other than maybe variety of games played. But even then, I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think putting Doyle as number 1, I think that the argument to be made for Doyle is really that this guy has the longest history of playing poker in the highest stakes of anyone. He's number 1. He's played the most high stakes games for the longest and the widest variety of games. He pioneered pioneered poker strategy for decades before sort of the solver era came along, I would say, or the online era came along, I would say. So in a lot of ways, Brunson is absolutely one of the top players of all time. And then some of the other names I would agree with. I think having Ike high up makes a lot of sense. Ike's played extremely well for his entire career, whether it's tournaments or online or live. And Ben Solsky at number 3, it's kind of interesting. I had a long think about where I thought Ben Solsky should go, because it's kind of difficult with Ben Solsky just because he almost only played online cash games. And while he was absolutely one of the best to ever do it in that area, won millions of dollars online, the fact he never really managed to step outside of that and play live tournaments, play live cash, be great in a different arena, I feel like it has to penalize him fairly strongly, despite the fact I do think he is one of the greatest poker minds that we've ever seen. What do you think about that, Kane?
I think Solsky's way too high. I have Solsky in my top 20, but I think putting Solsky in the top 3, the argument that you made is absolutely valid. He just doesn't have the live results. But also Solsky, let me ask you, Doug. I mean, was he ever the best heads-up no-limit player in the world?
Yeah, definitely.
In what years?
For, I don't know, 2012 to 14 or something, 13 or 14.
So
post Jungle, pre me.
He was better than Jungle heads up during those years.
I don't think Jungle played him during that time period. I could have this slightly off, but I'm pretty sure he was just about the top dog, because when I was coming up, I knew number 1 was Sauce, number 2 was Ike. I had that in my head. I knew that was the case, and I played every other person I possibly could before those two, because I knew they were the top 2. Then I played Ike, and then once I played Ike, I played Sauce, because that was it. That was the end of the road, and I knew that for years on my way up. So
the argument for Sauce is not only was he fantastic at No Limit Hold'em, he was also great at PLO, and he also played Six Max. But the argument against Sauce, again, hardly any live success to speak of. When you did play him, it wasn't a particularly close match. So the differential there in terms of skill, you could say, is quite high. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's certainly fair. But while that is the case, a big reason that it was like that, I think, was that he got the number 1. And then there's a huge problem with being number 1 in heads up, because when you get there, it's over for you. That's it. And now how it works is you either coach and stake other people to play, like I did, or you move on to other games and you become great at those, like Ben did. There's no other thing you can do until someone comes up that's really going to be very good and wants to take you on. So it's difficult, I think, to kind of maintain number one in heads up formats with longevity because there's no financial incentive to do so unless you just want to wait for the next guy that may never come.
Yeah. But nonetheless, you need to factor that in when you're talking about who the greatest poker player is of all time, right? It's very similar to me to the Tom Dwan situation, right? Tom Dwan issues a heads up challenge, and he has Jungleman take it on, and Jungleman just wipes the floor with him, right? So Ben Solsky may have been believed to be the best heads up player for those years, but in fact, you could have been better than Solsky heads up for quite some time prior. Is that fair?
He really had beaten everyone, and I think that you're downplaying the victories that he had over all of his opponents. I know that he just demolished Kane, for example, and a lot of the other guys at the top. He just demolished all of them. So I think that when you focus on the end of you know what it's kind of like looking at a really successful fighter or a boxer and then saying, yeah, but look at the fight he lost at the end. It's like, well, yeah, what about all the fights before where he won all of these matches consecutively, right? We should be looking at those. Yes, eventually it comes to an end, but yeah, at what point,
but
right?
the way it comes to an end, or the severity, right, is what I think it would be different if you and Sauce had a very close match and you ended up winning $5,000 at the end and barely edged him out versus it being more of a bloodbath, right?
I think that it's reasonable to say that the degree at which he lost by should have some impact. But if we look at the scope of his online results across all these game types, 6max, no limit, PLO, even mixed games, he played a lot of mixed games at the end there too. He was a strong winner in all of them, and that was exemplified by what his results were like online. Yes, he didn't have the winnings as of some of these other guys, but if you look at the stakes play, if you look at big blinds won at high stakes, Sauce might be number one. He didn't play 501k. He didn't play all these huge games back in the day in Full Tilt. He played them a little bit later on when there wasn't nearly the same degree of action. So I guess the way that I would look at it is I do think Ben Solsky is a top player and one of the greatest poker minds, but I think we're driving at a similar point near Kane in that neither one of us think that he should be ranked as high as this.
Yeah, no, it's definitely his ability to be the best in the world at two games. Solsky to me is kind of similar to like an old school Barry Sweet. It's like he's at the top of both heads up and 6max, no limit hold'em and PLO online without much going on live, right? And to kind of hammer home that point, like he was a good mixed game player online. He was never, I don't think, one of the best, but he was a good mixed game player online. And then he came and played Bobby.
By the end, he was basically the best, I think. No, I don't think anyone would online. I think so. Yeah, I could talk some mixed game. I think he started learning and he got better and he got better and he got better, and then no one would play him. My understanding. So
heads up or ring?
I think primarily heads up.
Yeah. And then he came to Bobby's room for a couple summers, apparently played badly, was a large loser, and then never came back, right? So he was never able to transition to live, right? Which is completely fine, and he made tons of money online, and he didn't need to.
What year was that? Do you know roughly time?
I don't know. I can find out.
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah. But to me, he doesn't have the versatility between live and online. Listen, to me, Ben Solsky is probably right around my top 10 of all time. But for that reason, he wouldn't be my number 3. And I think that having been, I would like to hear Kevin's argument for having Ben Solsky so far above Phil Ivey.
Yeah, it's a good question.
But right, well, I think it's fair to have Ben Solsky above Stu Unger. It's very fair, very fair in my opinion. But the rest of this list I like. I do want to talk about Doyle here because Doyle is in the number 1 spot. I think that I could make a very strong argument as to why Doyle Brunson is the best poker player of all time. If you want to talk about longevity being one of the factors that plays in here, Doyle Brunson just has to be number 1 on longevity, right? I don't think anybody would argue that. Even to this day, Doyle Brunson might not be as dominant at his game type, which is really cash game mix, as Eric Seidel still is at tournaments, but there is a big age differential between Doyle and Eric Seidel, right? So if you put Doyle back into Eric Seidel's age, he probably was that dominant at those game types. Doyle is still considered a very, very good player in some of the mixed games that he plays. Like, I don't think people will play Doyle heads up Raz, for example. And then Doyle probably is the number one winningest player in the history of public cash games. That has to say something, right? If we're giving Ivy a bunch of credit as being the biggest winner in dollars on online poker, and we're giving a shout out to Patrick for being number 2. We're talking about Dan Cates being number 3. Doyle Brunson, there's pretty strong consensus that he's the biggest winner in the history of public cash games in poker.
Strong argument.
And on that note, we have a lot of these guys we could talk about more, but spoiler alert, they're going to appear on future lists. So let's go ahead and slide on to Brian Rast top poker players. Now, Doug grabbed this list from Brian, and how would you describe it, Doug? He was hesitant to really like rank people, but he kind of had different tiers. How would you describe what he said?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit similar to with Koon. I think that he didn't want to rank things exactly, and he broke down basically a rough overview of where he would put people. I think that we can kind of see a lot of similarities to some of the other lists here. The top tier, Doyle, Phil, Ike, Ike in the top tier with the other two, which is somewhat interesting to me to put him there as well. The next tier, Chidwick, first appearance from really a designated tournament pro, which is actually kind of interesting. Maybe I should ask him a little bit more about why he thought Chidwick would make it there. I will say that a lot of tournament players seem to say that there is no doubt in the tournament world, everyone thinks Chidwick's number 1. I heard that from a lot of tournament players. I'm not sure if that's as recognized at the absolute top, but I heard that from a good number of players to the point where it seems to be at least in the thought process for who's the best player today, that it would be Chidwick. So maybe that's why he's number 1. Then he should be in the conversation. And then the honorable mentions as well, True Teller, Opie, and himself, which you got to give yourself an honorable mention. I will give a shout out to Rast though. We were talking about biggest snubs before. I didn't really think about it, but Rast was a huge snub. Rast has played really high stakes games for a long time, very successful. It's one of those things a little bit. It's not nearly as bad as the Opie story for me, but by the time I was playing versus Rast in live poker, I think Rast was viewed as kind of spewy and somewhat bad in tournaments, where he would be getting in way too light versus people where he just wasn't getting it in good. And there was 1 or 2 hands I remember specifically when I first started playing with Rast where I thought, oh my God, this guy is just spewing massively. But I think that it's just one of those situations where because I came across him at that exact point, it skewed my view of Rast. This guy is definitely one of the big winners from poker. He's played in a lot of huge games. He played the big bet mixed consistently in Vegas. He was probably the best player in that game, or one of the best players, if it wasn't Rast. He played that for at least a year or 2 while that was running. Played a bunch of other stuff. I'm sure I know he's played a good amount in Bobby's room and all these other places. So I definitely think that Rast should be getting at least some acknowledgement. And then if you look at his tournament resume, he's won a lot of tournament stuff too. I think he won the 50K Players Championship. He also won the Super High Roller Bowl. So tons of big wins, and a very skilled player that I think realistically should be in the top 20.
Yeah. I think Brian Rast was a pretty huge snub who we didn't mention last time. I completely agree. Rast is in my top 15. I think where Rast ranks himself absolutely makes sense. He has over $24 million in live tournament earnings. One of the winningest, live tournament players of all time. He's playing the biggest stakes cash games in the world. Not only big bet mix, but also limit games, mix games. He's constantly playing them in Bobby's room. He's considered one of the best players there. So I definitely think we should have Rast on that list. An interesting, I think, non-honorable mention by Rast. given all that, in my opinion, is Scott Seaver, because to me, Rast and Seaver have a lot of similarities in that way. They have a very similar dollars won in live poker tournaments, similar number of bracelets won. They both play Bobby's Room almost full time. They both had online success before going into the live scene. Some other things that are interesting about this list, as you mentioned, Stephen Chidwick. Chidwick, you got consensus, Doug, that he is the current GOAT in live MTTs in the high roller circuit. I also did a little research since our last podcast. Stephen Chidwick does play mix. He does play mixed tournaments, and he's very thoughtful in these games and plays them well. So that definitely influenced my impression of Stephen Chidwick and put him higher up on my list. I wouldn't say that Stephen Chidwick has yet cracked my top 10, but it's possible as I dive deeper. I mean, his poker mind is obviously amazing. It's possible that if I dive deeper and learn more about just how competitive he is in these games, and it would be great to get Rast, who regularly plays these games, opinion on whether or not Stephen Chidwick is in fact competitive today in a number of different game types. And then somebody who we haven't really spoken much about, who's consistently been near the top of everybody's list, is Ike. And I think we need to spend some time talking about Ike, because Ike, is definitely one of the top on my list. Not to give a spoiler of what's to come, but Isaac Haxton is one of the best online poker players of all time, and he's one of the best live poker players of all time. He's one of the best No Limit Hold'em players of all time, Pot Limit Omaha players of all time, and mixed game players of all time. He's one of the best cash game players of all time and tournament players of all time. You want to talk about versatility? Isaac Haxton's your guy.
And over basically his entire adult life, he's still fairly young compared to most of the people on this list. So a lot of room where he can grow into it. If we had to compare anyone that's in the older generation at the age that Ike is today, where were they at? Undoubtedly, Ike is extremely far ahead of all of them. I mean, I don't know who the people would be that would be close. Maybe a Negreanu-ish, but so much more impressive what Ike has done today. When I was making my list, I also had a lot of respect for Ike, just because there are so many games that Ike is considered to be a good player in, where you do not want him at your table with No Limit, PLO, cash games, tournaments. And there might be points where Ike, it's a little bit similar to Ivy in a way, where there aren't many types where Ike was number one, or many game types where Ike was the guy, but he was just always a very good player in all of these games, to where he was pretty much always bad to have at your table, regardless of what game it was. Also, and this is my bias, I talked about this at the start of the podcast, and we all have our biases when we look at different players, what makes them good. Coming up in the online era where Ike had already made it to high stakes and seeing Ike play a lot of these games before, it's just very clear to me how much skill he had to have in order to be able to do that and be able to play these games at a high level. I've played a lot of heads up versus Ike. I've played a chunk of ring versus Ike. I've played a chunk of tournaments versus Ike. I've played Ike in a lot of formats. And in all of them, Ike was between pretty good to very good. So I think something has to be said for someone that is consistently good at all of these all of these formats, and came up in the modern era where this guy obviously started with nothing and built everything from poker in games where it was a lot more difficult than probably some of the people that came along before him.
When you were playing Ike in Heads Up No Limit, did you consider him to be around a similar skill level to Solsky?
It was kind of, I would say that I think that Solsky's style was more complex, and it was more, I'm trying to think about how to say this. Solsky was doing more things that were off the beaten path, and he had thought about the full game tree more and the way that things would play on later streets. So you would end up in a lot more interesting turn and river situations in lines that were less taken, I think, versus Sauce compared to playing Ike. I found that Ike played a lot more aggressive pre-flop, and was a lot more punishing if you tried to, make some loose plays on earlier streets. I'm simplifying this to some extent. One thing I always found kind of weird about the way Ike played was he seemed to go through phases where he would play maybe different strategies. So maybe he would have an hour or two where he'd 3-bet you a lot, or 30 minutes, and then he would seem to go through this fit of calling. And if I filtered by last 100 hands, it seemed like he would definitely change strats. I don't know if he was building images one way and then going back the other. I'm not entirely sure, but
yeah, I remember talking to you about that at the time, playing Ike, because you almost felt like he had these different strategies laid out, like strategy A, strategy B, strategy C. And back then, you were very much, I think one of your biggest strong points was being very good at figuring out what someone's up to, and then kind of figuring out where in the game tree you can take advantage of that. And we were when we were talking about this, we were talking about how if Ike indeed does have like an A, a B, a C, a D, and that's not to grade the games, just like different labels. That could be an interesting counter to your approach, because there's nothing you could really pin down. You can't figure out, oh, he's like doing this on the turn, so I can respond with XYZ. He was just almost, I don't want to say arbitrarily, because they're well thought out strategies, but it's like he had these different modes that he would go into, these different gears, if you will.
yeah, it certainly seemed like he played that way. It's always possible that it was just random fluctuation, right? But the consistency at which, when I played Ike, he would just 3-bet me 27%, and then shortly after he 3-bet me 8%, and then all of a sudden he'd be 3-betting me, you know what I'm saying? It would just shift so massively. It would be kind of hard to imagine that it was.
Do you think that Ike was doing that, one, to try to adjust and exploit you, two, so that you couldn't exploit him, or three, just based on his mood?
That's a good question. I always looked at poker a little more through my opponent's eyes than my own. I guess I really tried to have, so my approach to poker was have a really solid, well-balanced baseline, and then try to look at poker through the way that they see poker. And that's where you're going to see in their game tree where their mistakes are, and then make my strategy counter those. And if they adjusted and started to realize that, then theirs would fix itself, and then I wouldn't be doing it anymore. Do you kind of know what I'm saying? So like, if, for example, they're falling too much to turn probe, I would just be probing a lot, regardless of whether they knew I was doing that or not. And then if their full turn probe dropped tremendously, then I would know to not do that anymore. So I would make slight adjustments in these lines that they had exploits in, and then if they figured it out, they would get like some slight EV until we got back to some kind of baseline, right? But my baseline was usually a little bit better than my opponent's. So I guess I didn't really think about it as Doug's doing this, well, I'm going to do X, as much as I was really just trying kind of countering his strategy. So I'm not entirely sure.
It's very Dan Cates' its approach to heads up. I think you would think very similarly in that way.
We were on the same side of things. It's kind of funny when I look at what my identity has become, especially with YouTube stuff, where I'm the guy that talks about strategy and especially solver stuff. And I never used a solver before 2 years ago, and I had my own theory on things, right? I had a good baseline compared to most of the players, but I was very much an exploit player. I figured out where in the game tree you had problems, and I just got all up in there and just tried to make sure that I punished you as hard as I could in all these lines you suck at. And I just tried to make it so you couldn't bluff profitably, and then figure out where your game tree was weak and just hammer it, and then play as loose as I possibly could in every one of those lines. So I certainly had an exploit style, and I feel like I've become a little bit of the poster boy within the general community for GTO strategies and solver stuff. Obviously not in the elite community or the high stakes community. I'm just certainly not that guy. But so just the general person on YouTube, they probably think that about me, where the reality was I spent almost my entire career not using a solver and playing an exploit strategy.
Yeah, that's worth noting about your battles with Ike, and we'll move on right up to this. Worth noting about your battles with Ike is he had those different strategies that he seemed to jump to, but we didn't know that much about quote unquote GTO strategy back then. So you didn't have like a baseline you could fall back to. You had your baseline, but it wasn't this really, evidence-based strategy that, was influenced by modern tools like we have now. So that's what makes that strategy like a little more viable. I think these days, doing such a thing where you just like kind of switch strategies on a dime, it probably wouldn't be quite as valuable. And on that note, let's go ahead and slide over to Chris Kruk's top poker players. Starting at the top with number 1, Timofey Kuznetsov. That's True Teller. Number 2, Phil Ivey. Number 3, Isaac Haxton. Number 4, Michael Thuritz. That's Chow Ren. Number 5, Jonas Malls, OTB Red Baron. Number 6, Doyle Brunson. Number 7, Linus Loliger. and number 8, Dale Negreanu. This is definitely more of an online heavy list. The first appearances today of Michael Thuritz and Jonas Malls, who are both two of the most dominant online players ever. Michael Thuritz, according to a lot of people, might be the biggest winner in the history of online poker. And he's been doing it for a long time. Jonas Malls, I think everyone knows OTB Red Baron, was the top 6 max player for a long time. What jumps out at you guys?
What jumps out is that Mustache Ike is not in my top 5 Ikes. But past that, I like these players. I think that Mikhail Thuritz is someone that you have to consider very strongly for your top 5. Good at a ton of formats of poker, battled in tons of formats of poker, played online for many, many years, was a top player in the mixed games, played No Limit, played PLO, played in Macau. An absolute beast at cash games, won millions and millions of dollars. The only thing that really you can say about Thuritz that's a negative is that he never stepped into tournaments. But, you might argue for your overall life, that's a positive. As a strict cash game player and as someone that's talented in all these forms of poker, I think that he's a pretty easy choice for top 20, if not top 5 or 10. I'll give one more critique as well. I think certainly a bit of a game selector, at least in the Macau streets. I think he practiced for a lot of stuff online, which is why he'd play people at the stakes he did. And the latter part of his career was to kind of practice for games in Macau, like I think some of the mixed games he played, stuff like that. But just a really strong player. And I got some interesting notes on Thuritz because I played him a little bit of heads up online, but he played a lot of my students. And he was one of the guys I really didn't like my students playing, because he's a player that would just put you into really weird spots where it would be like he would c-bet the flop, check turn, and he'd start raising you on rivers, and it would be weird boards where it didn't make that much sense, but maybe he didn't. I'm sure that he had a pretty balanced approach with it, but basically he constantly would be applying these pressure to you in unorthodox lines that you wouldn't study for and you wouldn't be prepared for. And I guess the reason it was so tough when I would watch it in hand histories where I'd be reviewing with my students afterwards, I could tell that my student would just have no clue. I don't know how to deal with this. He's just back raising 2x in this spot. He knows I don't have these kinds of hands. What do I do here? And this is before solvers, right? So then I have to think, what do I do here? And you get to kind of on the fly come up with these solutions. He was sort of tricky like that. He had a bit of a tricky style that was difficult to handle if you weren't really aware of the exact proportion of your range in different situations.
So Thuritz, do we have his online winnings publicly available anywhere? Because I couldn't find him on the high stakes DB, biggest winners. I didn't know he was one of the biggest online winners.
I think a lot of it is in untracked games / crossbooks, Kane. So I think it's a bit more, it's a little bit less, here's his FTP winnings. And by the way, that warps our view a little bit on Patrick Antonius and Phil Ivey, where we view them as the biggest winners ever, because in tracked stuff they were. But there are so many games that just didn't get picked up, or crossbooks that we don't know about, or all kinds of different forms of action that happened, but we just aren't privy to, like what happened for those guys. And so that actually is something that we should be aware of when we're thinking about Phil Ivey and Antonius, and even Solsky and Jungle, that it does say that they're the top 5 in cash games, but realistically, there are enough other games going on in crossbooks and sites that weren't tracked that we should realize that there's probably a pretty big difference between those lists and the actual truth.
One other quick note about Thuritz, according to Chris Kruk, he is an absolute beast at mix as well. So it's not just the big bet games that he's great at. He's also a beast at mixed games. And I like you said, I think a lot of that was kind of training for Macau. But nonetheless, a lot of well-respected people think that he's a top player in those formats as well. Interesting.
Yeah. Thuritz, I don't think ever got, just counterpoint, I don't think he ever got great at PLO. But to Doug's point about Thuritz, game selecting in Macau, it's my understanding that you can't really game select. So you kind of need to start the game with other good players and you kind of play against them all day. And then at the end of the day, you hope that a VIP comes for a couple hours. And some days the VIP never comes, right? To me, as somebody who was a game selector online, this is a crazy idea that I'm going to sit here and battle against regs for 10 hours and hope that some magical VIP comes at the end of the day that I can win money from. But that was Thuritz's life for a very long time.
Another person we got to talk about on this list is OTB Red Baron. Doug, what are your initial thoughts on OTB and just his appearance in the top 5 in general, and maybe where you would rank him?
It's been difficult for me when I look at players like this because my instincts, my gut feel, in my heart, I think that they're top players. And I think that a bunch of these guys are bullshit. Like your Ivies, your Doyles, your Chip Races. Screw those guys. They don't know what it's like to have to come up in the actual legitimate toughest streets in the entire world that have ever existed for poker. And this guy did and was the absolute best at it. The #1 best player in the hardest, most competitive game type ever. These other players wouldn't even get to 1-2 online. And now I'm supposed to not put him in my top 5. That's how I feel. But then I talk myself off the ledge. And I think, okay, he hasn't played live poker. He's not been successful in other formats. He didn't do well online in other game types. He wasn't a great heads-up no-limit player. He wasn't a great ring PLO player. So can I really just say that this guy, because he was the best 6-max player ever, or one of the best couple 6-max players ever, he can be a top 5 player? And the answer is probably not. But in my heart tells me this guy's a top 5 player ever. Fuck a lot of these other people for even being above them because they're clearly worse at no-limit hold'em. The Cadillac of poker.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, where you're really colored by how you came up in poker. And, we had Daniel Negreanu with a lot of the old school guys on there because when he was coming up in, the late 90s, early 2000s, those were the guys he looked up to. Similarly, though you weren't really, I wouldn't say looking up to OTB because he kind of got in there towards the end of your online career, if I remember the timeline correctly. It's still, he was in the same streets you were, he was in your neighborhood. So of course you're going to respect him more. It kind of just makes sense, at least in your gut.
It's tough. This isn't even that, Brady. This isn't even about the bias. This is just straight up no limit hold'em cash. Who is the best player on this list? And it's Linus or it's Jonas. And if we put those two against every other player on this entire list, they're just clearly better than everyone else on there. And that's hard for me. It's something that I've come to terms with over the course of making this list, but it's not a debate that these guys are better at no limit hold'em or not. They are better. They are so much better than the rest of this list, at least so much better than most of the list, and then better than the rest. And now I'm supposed to just not have them in my top 5. I don't know. I mean, part of me was supposed to put the 5 best players on this list, but I know I can't do it.
Maybe we have to do a video series, best no limit hold'em players currently, or something like that. Maybe to scratch that itch, we have to cover that.
We can't just put the 5 best players on our list, right, Kane?
Absolutely not. No, that would be like, taking the 5 best modern baseball players and not putting Babe Ruth on your list of best players of all time because today he wouldn't be one of the best, right? And to your point about these guys, being the best today and what they've had to do in order to get to that spot online. What do you think that a guy like Brunson, or if Chip Reese were still alive today, what do you think that they would say about their path versus these guys' path? I think there's a very strong argument that the guys who became the best players in the world back in the day, the Reeses and the Brunsons, that was a more difficult path than booting up a solver and figuring out solutions, right? I think it's entirely possible you hear a guy like Chip Reese say, oh yeah, if I were around today, I could, figure out those solutions too. And it comes down today more to work ethic, whereas before it was your poker mind, right? You had to have a great poker mind. You had to figure things out on the fly, right? Whereas today, if you just put in enough hours, you can be competitive against some of the best in the world, right?
Well, I think it's a different kind of difficult. Like you had what the old school players went through, and I wish we had more info on it, is it's a more abstract difficult. They had to figure out games trial by fire. Poker is a very nasty learning environment. You can get feedback for a certain play that doesn't turn out to actually be that helpful because it was variance. So they had to see through that noise, find the signal, and figure out the right things to do. They had to figure out how to get in the right games, what games they're supposed to be playing. They had no websites to study, probably very few books, if any. They were the ones writing them in a lot of cases. Whereas today, it's more of a technical challenge, right? Like the info's out there, you just have to be able to seek it. There's still some noise to cut through, but it's a lot easier to find the signal in general. And then, like you said, Kane, it comes down to work ethic and probably a little bit of natural talent, natural ability as well.
I would say the most difficult thing in those days versus today is I don't think that Jonas Moles had to worry about if he flops three of a kind versus this guy is going to get shot outside the saloon. So there's certainly a different degree of difficulty in today's games versus back in the day, but just straight up how hard it is to win, even with those tools, it's just incredibly difficult to win in today's game online.
So let me ask you this, Doug. Do you think that you have a higher probability if you decided tomorrow that you wanted to be the best no limit hold'em player in the world, right? Do you think you have a higher probability of achieving that goal today? Or do you think you had a higher probability of achieving that goal in 1960?
1960.
I totally disagree. I think today you have a clear path.
I don't think I could possibly do it because the people that have made it, so everyone's doing the same exact thing now because you have to do the exact same thing to make it today, and you're not going to be as good as the people that are the best at it. So I think you can't, because you have to have a degree of memorization and practical application and heuristics that take years to build that I'm simply never going to catch. I will never catch up now. I'm too far behind. Everyone's learning the exact same thing. Whereas in the 60s, you might come up with your own stuff. There's no solutions. No one knows what's right. You can come up with your own thing. You could trailblaze and do it. I think it's actually even close. I think I have no chance of ever being the best no limit hold'em today if I dedicate the rest of my life to it. I think I would have a decent chance just by being good at thinking about games and critical thinking, just to get to the top echelon back in the day.
Is there an element also of like, so it's like, it was like a smaller player pool back in the day, and you could argue that that's a point that's easier. But is there a point to be made, and it's kind of hazy in my mind, but it was harder to get into that pool? Like, it was almost hard to become a poker player in the 60s in a way. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
Like the availability of games, like figuring out what you even have to do, it was way less rigid than it is today.
The problem with today is everyone plays exactly the same. It's just who memorizes it more, and there are people that have years on you. So how are you ever going to beat them? Right. How are you ever going to beat someone or Kane? Like, for example, I would say, for example, I think that I'm a somewhat intelligent person, but I don't think I'm a super intelligent person. And I have a fairly good memory, but I don't think I have a super good memory. So how am I going to beat people that are just simply smarter and have better memory than me, who have been studying the same thing for longer, and we all have to learn from the same source? How will I ever beat them? I won't. I would never become the greatest player. I would be stone dead.
Yeah. But nonetheless, you are still one of the best heads-up no-limit players in the world, right? However, if we go back to the 1960s, we throw Doug Polk in there with no solvers, no hand histories, no information. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that you would be one of the best heads-up no-limit players in the world.
It depends on how many games are even running. How many heads-up no-limit games are running in 1960?
It really didn't seem like many, and it kind of seems like we talk about them. Like there's those legendary heads-up games between like Johnny Moss and I don't remember who the other one was, but like we almost hear about the heads-up games that happened back then. But maybe they were more common than we think. It's hard to say.
Johnny Moss and Nick the Greek, and that match was made up. So
there you go. So that one didn't even happen. Maybe heads-up was real rare.
Moving on to our next slide here, Mike.
Yeah, Nick the Greek did play Chip Reese heads up, and Nick the Greek won a decent amount from him. So I guess that's a slight knock on Chip Reese.
All right, onward. 2. Daniel Strelitz, his top poker players. Daniel is a kind of a circuit grinder. I thought it would be good to get someone like his opinion in here. Phil Ivey at number 1, Stephen Chidwick at number 2, Phil Galfond at number 3, Phil Hellmuth at number 4, Scott Seaver at number 5, and Justin Bottomo at number 6. I believe that's the first appearance in an actual rigid top list for Chidwick. Brian Rast had mentioned him. And then first appearance for Phil Hellmuth, surprisingly, on our 9th slide.
Dude, these
Chat-
are all first. The entire thing is first. It's first appearance
Yes.
of Chadwick, first of Galfond, first of Helmuth, first of Seaver, and first of Bonomo. They're all first.
Except for Ivy, of course.
Well, yes, except for Ivy, but all 5 of the names below are first.
Yeah, so we have a lot to talk about here.
My question, Mike, what do you think he's going to name his first son? I'm going with Phil. What do you think?
I think he might already have a son, but
Oh.
I would guess Phil as well. Yeah.
Second son.
Yeah. I think we should maybe jump off here with Scott Seaver. He wasn't included in the fan vote top 20, but Daniel chose to throw him in to his list anyway. How do you guys feel about? Let's start with Kane. How do you feel about Scott Seaver making a top 5 list?
Yeah, I like Scott Seaver a lot. I have Scott Seaver at number 10 overall in my list. Scott Seaver just has so much versatility. He's done it live. He's done it online. He's good at every single game type. He has 24 million in live tournament earnings. He has a number of bracelets. I think he has 3 bracelets. So basically, if you're looking at all the boxes of what things make a player great, you can check every single box for Scott Seaver. He's just a fantastic all-around player.
I feel that Scott Seaver is pretty overrated. I think that he has an uncanny ability to talk in hands that makes him very memorable. And I also think that he's a bit of a pathological liar. And so he's able to tell you a story in a hand that he's in completely honestly because he just convinces himself of the thing that's not true. So I think on the river, when he's talking about hands, I think he's convinced himself in his mind of a thing that isn't true. And that's why he doesn't have tells with it, because he believes it himself. That's why he's so good at it. Scott Seaver lies about so many random little things all the time. He lies consistently and at a pace that it's truly remarkable. I've heard hand histories that I was at the table for, and then I'm at a different table. Scott's telling the hand back, and he's just making shit up. And I said, Scott, I played that hand. He's like, oh, whatever. Just right back into the story. Scott is not... Basically, I really don't think Scott belongs up here. Look, Scott's played a lot of big games. He's got a lot of memorable hands. He's had some pretty good results, but I feel like he's a bit of a degenerate. He hasn't put in the legwork. He lacks discipline. He kind of plays like Jungle if Jungle didn't do the getting better part. And I just don't really respect Scott Seaver in a top 5 list. Sorry, Kane. We have to hard disagree on this one.
Oh, the shots
so
fired
there's
on this pod.
So there's a lot there. Let me start by accepting one of your points and asking you this. Does being a good liar make you a better poker player?
Yeah, probably, I would say.
So part of the reason I ask is Scott Seaver, I think, is one of the best in the world at Werewolf. Or hidden identity games, right? Which are games that require
Doesn't even remotely surprise me. In fact, that really just proves the whole thing, I think.
Right. It requires you to be a bullshitter and to convince people that what you're saying is true. Poker is a different type of game like that because you don't need to actually make a speech, right? But Scott Seaver's speech play is actually very good and effective at live poker, specifically against amateurs. But to me, getting back to the nuts and bolts of it, you can't deny that Scott Seaver has had tremendous success at every single game type, at every single at both live and online, right? For you said earlier that you really care about having live and online results. Scott Seaver is that guy.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, Kane. Some of the things I've heard about some of the games in Vegas for Scott over maybe not the last few years, but the years before, there was some pretty bad Scott Seaver stories as far as the games went for him over the summer. There are some rumors about, how much Scott lost in some pretty big games. And I just don't really think that Scott's in there battling in a lot of games. He's constantly picking his spots. I just don't think that I don't think he's very close to the list.
Well, here's what I will say. I think that we should so Scott Seaver these days plays mostly high stakes mix, and we should to some degree defer to the high stakes mix players, the guys who are regularly in those games who we spoke about. And to your point, he wasn't on Rast's list anywhere. He wasn't on Zack's list anywhere. So we do need to pick up on some of the cues there. The guy is one of the highest earners of live tournaments. He has 3 bracelets. Every single year, he doesn't put in the volume of a guy like Sean Deeb, right? But he's one of the guys who were drafted for the poker player championship thing they do, right? So he's good at every single game type. To me, he's not top 5 overall, but I have him ranked. In my personal rankings, I have Scott Siever at 10.
Who do you have at 11, Kane?
Brian Rast.
All right.
And like I said, they're similar to me in a lot of ways.
Different flavors here, but we got to talk about some of the other names. There's so much to talk about here. I feel like maybe we should even just talk about some of these in the next slide. But the first appearance, I believe, of Phil Hellmuth. And I gotta say, Brady, it was a good idea to get a circuit grinder in here so that we could get some more tournament players up on the list, because we have been doing an injustice to people that play the tournament format.
I know. Chat would agree with you quite strongly. Chat, every single time we switched slide, the chat was like, "No, Hellmuth still what?" Like they could not believe it. So you're welcome, chat. We got Daniel Strelitz here for you. He put Hellmuth at number 4. We don't need to talk about him anymore. I'm talking about chat. We can now talk about him.
It's tough with Phil Hellmuth because he's just simply not a great cash game player. And even though he has great results over his life playing tournaments, his play is just so non-fundamentally sound that it's very difficult to watch him play and think anything other than, what's this guy doing? And when you see someone play like that, even if they're able to pull it off in a way that wins money, it's just very tough, I think, to put them in a top 5 list. And I think that's one of the reasons why most of the players that or all of them until now, have not put Hellmuth in there, is because it's hard to point to things with Hellmuth and say that's why, other than the fact that he has 16 WSOP bracelets.
Yeah, I agree with all that, but it basically comes down to, are you the type of guy who you care about talent or you care about results, right? I mean, it's like, it would be like comparing Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady, right? Some people think that Aaron Rodgers is a better quarterback than Tom Brady, right? But Tom Brady has results. The same thing might be true about when you're talking about Phil Hellmuth. Phil Hellmuth has the most WSOP bracelets of all time. Now, I was speaking to somebody about this list over the weekend, and he made a great point, which is that maybe people tend to overrate WSOP bracelets. Yes, Hellmuth has 16 bracelets, but if you combine bracelets and WPT titles and EPT titles and all these things, does Negreanu start to compete with Hellmuth as one of the greatest tournament players of all time? Right? All of a sudden, if you throw in high roller titles, does Seidel start to compete with Hellmuth as one of the greatest tournament players of all time?
Well, I think what Seidel has done is more impressive than Hellmuth, right? Because he's played in such stronger fields with such better players for so long. Whereas Hellmuth, there's a bit of a look, like Hellmuth thinks he's winning in all these tournaments that he late regs for in the 100Ks and shows up late, and everyone jokes his ROI is going up. But the reality is that in a high roller tournament, if I know poker shares isn't a thing anymore, I think, or I don't know if Timex dismantled it or if he sold it or what, but if there was a line up publicly on, I can bet on Phil Hellmuth's result in a high roller, just a standardish high roller, he's obviously negative ROI. And when you look at a player like that, it's kind of hard to be impressed with it because he's not even a winning player according to what the market thinks. I think Hellmuth would argue the market's wrong because he seems to win regardless of these things. He's been an underdog in almost all these heads-up challenges. He's won basically all of them. He's won all these WSOP events. He's constantly winning money in tournaments. He probably wins in his billionaire cash game friends games as well. So Hellmuth would say the market always says that, but yet I'm always winning anyway, huh? And it's a kind of reasonable point, but it's just tough to me when I see someone play and they seem to play bad it's just hard for me to put a vote of confidence in there as a best player if whenever I see you play, I think, God, this guy's bad. And I just have to see that constantly over and over again. It just kind of trumps the bracelets to me.
Yeah, one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, hands that come to mind are like there was that recent heads up hand that he played. I could be getting the details slightly off, but he like limped the button with ace jack suited and then folded to like a 7 blind raise or something like that. Just like, or maybe a 7 blind jam. That would be unreal if it was
7
that.
blind raised.
Okay, well that is a large raise, but still ace jack suited. I mean, come on.
But what was he correct? Wasn't he correct in doing so?
Yeah.
I mean, but that's okay. So that is the point. That's the point, right?
And that was where I was going to go to, is like, I wonder how much higher, like Doug in particular, but everyone would rank Hellmuth if we had never seen any hands. The whole card cam had never been invented, but somehow poker was just as big. We had never seen Hellmuth's cards. We only had results. We only saw him winning. How much would that help? Like, I feel like it would actually help a lot, which is pretty interesting.
Well, here's what I think is also an interesting point. What if after that ace jack limp and fold, right, Hellmuth could actually make an articulate argument as to exactly why he did it. Oh, I've played X number of hands with my opponent, and I've never seen him. He's only raised 10% of the time out of the big blind when I limp the small blind. And when he makes it 7 big blinds, I think it's weighted towards ace king for whatever reason, because I saw him play whatever hands. Now, all of a sudden, are we thinking that Hellmuth is one of the best players of all time? Because here's what I can say about Hellmuth. He has some of the best poker intuition of any player on this list, of any player of all time. And the reason I'm able to say that confidently is because the guy doesn't do work off the felt. The guy doesn't study. He just shows up and wins consistently. And that's because of his intuition.
It hurts me to say what I'm about to say. It hurts me because this sentence is just so stupid. But I truly believe that Phil Hellmuth is the luckiest poker player to play of all time. And I think it's not even remotely close. I can't even think of someone that would be sort of close. I can't even think of someone, because he wins in these games and we think of these hands he plays awesome. But then what about all of the hands where he just doesn't make money or loses money because he plays a hand terribly? There was a hand where he just punted off versus jungle in a heads-up match where it was just time to make a move, and he had 3 deuce and just ran it in some crazy spot where he 3-bet or 4-bet. I can't even remember the pre-flop action. That hand should never be in there, and then jungle had 2-pair and called him down. I think you brought this up, Ken, and I think so. Maybe I'm crazy. And he calls down with 2-pair, and he has the 3 high. Or some of the hands he played versus Negreanu where he just plays hands just terrible, but a lot of them just seem to naturally work out. I can't explain it because I have not seen Phil Hellmuth play hands well.
But Doug,
I've seen lots of not playing hands well.
Okay, let me ask you this. How come when Phil Hellmuth does that with deuce 3, that's him not playing a hand well? But when Jungleman 7-bets the flop on 8-4 deuce with ace deuce, that's him being a brilliant poker player?
Well, the difference is that in that spot, Jungle has a reason why Tom Dwan's range is capped. But in the spot that I'm talking about, it was a clearly uncapped situation where it was just a standard line. So if I call a 3-bet and you barrel off, I'm just going to call you appropriately. There's no reason I can't have good or bad hands. You're just out there in the wind. You know what? You're just in the jungle with a sword, just chopping vines. He's just chopping away the vines. Whereas in the other one, there's a reason why Jungle knows that Tom Dwan can't have the good hands.
Yes, you're talking about the hand specifically, but you're not talking about the match. You're not talking about the metagame. You're not talking about the player, right? Phil Hellmuth, I think, more than Dan Cates, understands the way that his opponents perceive him. And maybe for whatever reason, for whatever vibe his opponent was giving off to him at that time, he just felt like now is a time where Jungleman will fold. And maybe that time he was wrong. But most of the time when he has those feelings, Doug, he's right.
Are we sure about that? Are we sure that the times he's had these feelings that he's been right? Or are we just thinking about the times where it did work out? Because I can remember a time where he folded queens with 3 blinds, blind versus blind on Poker After Dark, and he was not right. I can think of a time where he ripped in $100,000 on the flop versus a check raise with the nuts against the second nuts and was not right. I can think of all kinds of hands along Phil Hellmuth's career where he wasn't right. I think it might be one of those things where if you play enough hands crazy, you're going to have some hands where you look like a genius or you look like an idiot.
Let's just talk about that hand against you. There was in another universe, you made that call. If you were feeling differently that day, you make that call. That wasn't an easy fold for you. And if he plays the hand the way he's supposed to, right, then it's possible that an action killing turn card comes and he doesn't get all of your chips. It's in fact somewhat likely that if he check raises or if he overcalls there and then and the way the hand plays out, he's not going to get all of your chips by the river.
Well, he can 3-bet small, and then I have to continue. He can also just call. If he 3-bets me small, I call. He guarantees to make 15K more versus my specific hand, and I'm probably calling bricks.
You're calling down. You're calling down turn and river.
It would be close. It'd be way closer. It would be a lot closer than what happened. I mean, I'm definitely calling the flop 3-bet.
I think that Hellmuth thought that you were going to call with a set or with 2-pair and he was wrong, right? But a lot of times Hellmuth will make that play and he'll be right. And here's one example of it. The first year that they ran the 1-drop, it was very early stages of that tournament. It was Hellmuth against some online player. I think it was Negro Vente, or Roland Detroit, or something was in that tournament. And they were like 250 big blinds deep pre-ante or something. And it goes open from under the gun, Roland Detroit, and Hellmuth all in. What do you think Hellmuth has? Come on, we know what he has, right? Goes back to Roland Detroit. He calls with kings. Hellmuth wins a 500 big blind pot in level 1 of the biggest tournament in the history of poker. How many other people would play the hand that way and pick up 500 big blinds right there?
Or open. Well, he picks up 250. Open 3-bet, 4-bet.
No, not under the gun against Hellmuth pre-ante. I call kings there. I call a 3-bet against Hellmuth.
Dude, if you're the kind of guy that's calling a 250 big blind jam with kings, you're also not the kind of guy that's scared to 4-bet kings. I'm not buying both these stories. You're not simultaneously willing to put in every last chip versus a jam and then also not willing to 4-bet kings.
I mean, so you're going to 4-bet call a 5-bet shove?
Kane, can I ask you, what are we doing? What are we doing right now? You okay over there? Everything good?
I think that you need to give credit where credit's due. And Phil Hellmuth is able to exploit his opponents in certain spots where nobody else in the world can. Weaker opponents, yes, granted. He's not, listen, if we're talking about the breaking down the things that make players great, right? One of my things is dominance. That means you need to be able to compete with the best. Hellmuth doesn't have that part, okay? Let's just agree on that right now. But one of the things is being able to dominate weaker players. Hellmuth is better at dominating weaker players than Linus, okay? I don't think there's any argument there. I think you put Hellmuth in a game of fish and Linus in a game of fish. Linus is going to play his game. Even today in No Limit Hold'em, I probably take Hellmuth as a bigger winner.
All right, let's get the game going. I'll call Linus. You call Hellmuth. Mike, you call the fish. We'll have it at the lodge. We'll stream this, and we're going to do the Linus versus Hellmuth challenge because I'm going to take one of the greatest heads-up or the greatest No Limit players of all time, and you can have Hellmuth. All right, let's talk about somebody else for a second here because we have a few sides to get through, and we're actually running pretty long already. Galfond, I think maybe the second time we've seen Galfond on the list. I think Koon had him in there, but maybe I'm incorrect. Galfond is someone that I thought about it more, and I was coming around a little bit on it because originally I didn't think Galfond was anywhere near my top 5. The more I thought about it, top online player for years, even if he had sort of fallen off by the end of that a little bit in some of the ring formats, came back with a vengeance with these challenges, beat tons of great players in these heads-up PLO challenges. Also a good live player, has won bracelets, has played a bunch of private games, the high stakes cash games in Vegas. I think he has a great mind for poker, and I didn't have him this high, but I came around a bit on the Galfond afterwards. I think the Galfond last pod I argued sauce over Galfond, but the more I think about it, I think it should have been the other way around.
Yeah, I'm glad you came around. I think Galfond's one of the best in poker history if we're talking about longevity, right? He was doing this when I was coming up in poker, and he's still at the very top, very similar to Dan Cates or Ike Haxton in that way. And also, he's no longer one of the best no-limit hold'em players in the world, or even in the conversation, really. But back in the day, he literally was one of the best no-limit hold'em players in the world. He was winning.
Yep.
He was winning the most big blinds per 100 in the Gi games than anybody else. He was winning more big blinds per 100 than Tom Dwan. He was winning more big blinds per 100 than Ivy in those games, or Patrick, who played those games, or Juanda, or Hacker D Dang, who were playing those games a little bit. At that point, they were kind of on their way out, and they sometimes selected and played heads up and three-handed and didn't really play the six-handed as much. The only other person who I'd say was close in those six max games was Haxton, but Haxton would not play Galfond heads up at that time. Hardly anybody would play Galfond heads up at that time, no limit hold'em. And today, people will play him in heads up PLO, but they'll lose. I'm actually really interested to see what's going to happen with the jungle Galfond.
It's going to be a fun sweat. I'm looking forward to that one for sure.
His Galfond's longevity has been amazing too. I mean, I remember him not running so great in those super high stakes games out of the gate when he first kind of started taking a shot. If he had ran good in those, his longevity would be even better. But I mean, even so, it's been about 10, 12 years that he's been at or near the top, which is pretty amazing stuff. Let's go ahead and slide on here. We have a few more to get through before we reveal the fan vote. Now we've got Faris Jaka's top poker players. He kind of had two little groups here. So his top five, he has a tie at number 5. Number 1, Phil Ivey. Number 2, Chip Reese. Number 3, Tom Dwan. Number 4, Stephen Chidwick. Number 5 is Helmuth and Isaac Haxton. And then his wild cards, not exactly sure what he meant by this, but it's just people he wanted to kind of give a shout out to. Stu Unger, Doyle Brunson, and Phil Galfond. So I want to read, Faraz sent me like a lot of thoughts on, each of these players and why they made it. I want to read some of what he said about Tom Dwan, because this is the first appearance for Tom Dwan on the list. So I kind of want Faraz to make the case here since he's the one putting him there. Just going to kind of read the gist of it. I'm placing this quote. I'm placing Tom Dwan here under the assumption that what I know about him is accurate. Strong start. I'm not necessarily following the high stakes cash results too closely, but when he did play online regularly, he was a big winner at some of the biggest stakes and willing to battle everyone and played a variety of formats. He's basically been able to do the same in the live realm. So we've, I feel like we've touched on Tom Dwan a little bit here today. What do you think about him cracking an actual top 5, Kane?
Not a fan. Not a fan at all. I mean, to me, like in my era, a lot of it was about how tough are the games you're playing, right? Who are you willing to play? And finally, what is your win rate in those games? And we kind of spoke on this when we were talking about Solsky and his win rate over time, but how it's a bit of a knock on him, like how Doug was able to not just beat him for a little bit, but beat him for a lot. To me, Tom Dwan is somebody who was willing to play everybody, but he wasn't really winning very much money. He in his entire online poker career on poker table ratings, he was winning like 2 or 2.5 big blinds per 100. That's not dominating those games, right? I view Tom Dwan as kind of like an Isildur. He's somebody who wants to play the highest stakes and will play anybody at the highest stakes. The only difference is Dwan was a little bit better than Isildur, at least at No Limit Hold'em and Pot Limit Omaha. And so it got to the point where he just had this mystique about him and nobody really wanted to play him for some time because they thought he was good. But then people started to say, oh, wait a second, Tom Dwan actually isn't that good. And as I mentioned in the last podcast, there were several players who I took action in who people maybe haven't even heard of these names of these players, right? They certainly were never considered some of the best no-limit players of all time. And they were beating Tom Dwan handily in heads-up no-limit hold'em.
I've been a bit of a broken record on this, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet. The reason that Tom Dwan shouldn't be in the top 5 is that he's not very good at poker.
Short and sweet indeed. All right, we've talked about all of these other guys pretty extensively, so let's go ahead and slide on.
I think it's interesting, real fast. I think we got to, Doug, we need to think a lot long and hard about Chidwick, because to me, when I think something and then some other top minds in the community time after time again say that whatever I'm thinking might not be right. I didn't I wasn't even thinking about Chidwick being in my top 5 or 10, but he's just appearing on these lists so often that it's definitely something to think about.
It certainly is, because if he's the best tournament player, and then he's also got some mixed game background, and he's good in those games as well, he's going to be surprisingly well-rounded and absolutely top-notch at just about the most competitive format or second most competitive format. So I think that he's a pretty reasonable selection, and maybe it's one of those things where just the fact that we're not privy to some of his exploits in other areas might be holding us back a little bit. But I think that putting Chidwick in your top 5, it's not something that I did, but I can certainly see the logic for it, and I think it's a reasonable choice. Also, I feel like he gets more when there's a player that plays tournaments. I feel like they put him more in there than the cash game players. I definitely see a little bit more cash game guys leaning towards cash players, tournament guys leaning towards tournaments.
It's almost like people have their own opinions and they're colored by their life experiences. Weird how that works. All right, sliding on to Gary Blackwood's top poker players. Number 1, True Teller. Number 2, David Oppenheim. Number 3, Dan Cates. Number 4, Linus Loliger. Number 5, Raul Gonzalez.
Ooh,
That's his screen name, right? Is that his actual name?
No,
yeah,
that's
okay.
a screen name.
Yeah, that's a screen name. Number 6, Victor Blom. Number 7, Phil Galfon, and number 8, Stu Unger. Victor Blom is an interesting inclusion. I mean, if we were to talk to Gary, I'm pretty familiar with his thinking. I'm quite certain he wouldn't argue that like Victor's like this, on the pedestal, amazing poker player. But I think there's some level of like respect being given here to how much of a legend he is. Once again, it's just everyone has a little bit of a different definition of what the best poker player is, so that's naturally going to happen. Doug, can you talk a little bit about who Raul Gonzalez is? Because I'm not super familiar with him, other than him playing some heads up, and I'm sure in that case that the chat and such isn't either.
Yeah, let me just make a quick note here that on next week's podcast, I can make fun of some of these choices. So Raul Gonzalez is a German player, played a lot of heads up no limit. I actually played a lot of heads up versus him across many different sites. There was a point where he would sit on every site, and then there was a million skins on every site, so you could effectively multi-account because you were like playing on a different skin where you can get a different account name, so it was totally legal. But you could hop on with a new name, and my strategy was play a million skins and play Raul Gonzalez on every single site and just hop around. And then they started to realize I was doing that, so then I'd start to do weird things pre-flop or post-flop to make it look like I was a different player, but it was really just me trying to trick them into thinking that I wasn't actually still me. And then I talked about it after the fact, and in the German camp, they had a chat, and they'd argue about if it was me or not. It's good times in the heads up streets. Anyway, he basically played a lot of heads up poker. Him and Johnny, hit and run me, please, or don't hit and run me, please. They played heads up no limit on basically every site. They were very successful with that. He then moved over to playing triple draw. I think for a bit he was probably the best triple draw player in the world, at least up there. And from there, I'm not sure what he's up to these days, but certainly a mainstay of the high stakes poker scene online. And if you were playing heads up formats, you probably played Volker somewhere along the way.
Yeah, it's not just triple draw. He's good at mixed games in general. He's good at 8-game. I don't think for compared to the mixed game players, he's very good at big bet. And compared to the mixed game players, I don't think like he's one of the strongest 08 players in the world, for example. But his draw games are good, and his big bet games are not good compared to the big bet players, but compared to the mix in the mixed players, he's very, very good. There's Oppenheim. There's your boy, Doug. Back up there, number 2.
My boy. I got a lot of boys in these lists. me and all my best friends.
Interesting about Gary Blackwood's list is he is really giving credit to people who battle hard at multiple games against the best and are firing hard regardless of their results. Right, because I view Victor and Stu as kind of in a similar category where they wanted the biggest stakes games, they wanted the most action, and maybe they didn't have the best results, but God damn it, they were going to be there. And I think Gary really gives a nod to guys like that.
I think this list is another good example of how our personal experiences of poker color our list, because Gary, I believe of anyone we've went through, he's who started poker the most recently. I want to say he started playing for a living in maybe like 2016 or something like that. So quite fresh compared to everyone else on the list. And that's kind of reflected here with a lot of online guys. And then, Stu Unger specifically with, how legendary he is. It makes sense that he just cracks in there.
No Ivy.
Yeah, no Ivy is the biggest thing. If you guys wanna inquire about that, GazzyB1233 on Twitter, you want to give him some needles. I see the chat a little upset at this list. Go let him know. All right, sliding on to my list, starting off with Phil Ivey, then True Teller, then Dan Cates, Michael Thuritz, Isaac Haxton, Chip Reese, and Dale Negreanu. I had Phil Hellmuth on here at number 7, and I didn't have Thuritz, but then I just kept thinking about it, and I kind of injected, or rather it was Ike who I injected in, and that knocked Phil Hellmuth to number 8 off this slide. We've talked about all these guys pretty well, so I don't think there's any reason to dwell on this. We could slide over to Kane's list. Kane, you want to read this out from 1 to 10?
Sure. I got Ivy up top, number 2 Ike, 3 Dan Cates, 4 Ben Tollerene, who I think is making his first appearance, 5 Chip Reese, 6 Phil Galfond, 7 True Teller, 8 Doyle Brunson, 9 Ben Solsky Sauce, and 10 Scott Seaver.
Yeah,
we should probably talk about Tollerene, right? Because I think it's his first time on this list. I originally, when I made my list, had Tollerene around number like 15 or something. But then after doing some more research, he is the 4th biggest winner in the history of online poker. And he was playing at a time where it was harder to win money online than when Phil Ivey or Patrick Antonius was playing, or even Jungle, when Jungle made a majority of his money. So if you adjust those dollars for how difficult the games were, right, Ben Tollerene may be the biggest winner in the history of online poker. He's somebody who competed for many, many years at the very top of Heads Up PLO, but he was also very good at Heads Up No Limit. I think that I heard Doug in a video one time say that Tollerene became better than Doug at Cap No Limit, so at least in one form of No Limit, or at least that Tollerene sat Doug and Doug didn't want the action. But Tollerene also played 6-max, 6-max PLO, 6-max No Limit Hold'em, and he was good in those games. When I was playing with him, like pre-Black Friday, he wasn't considered one of the best, but he was one of the 50 regulars you'd point to as being the guys in the 25-50 or 50-100 6-max No Limit games.
It's interesting with Tollerene because I have to put how I personally feel about him to the side and try and analyze his play. And Ben is no doubt a phenomenal poker player, played at the absolute pinnacle of online in both No Limit and PLO, has a great mind for poker. He's a very good student of the game. He learns well. And just because he scams me, that doesn't change the fact that he's not one of the best players. I will say that he didn't really transition to live in a meaningful way that I think would bolster his case here. However, he does have a decent chunk of live tournament cashes, so it's got at least something to his credit there. But I do think that he was a legend of online poker, and it's pretty reasonable to have him in your top 5. I think top 10 is very reasonable. Top 5 might be pushing it. I think having him over True Teller, for example, I just don't really agree with that. I think True Teller is a substantially better player overall if you look at their entire career's work. But all in all, I think that he certainly has a place in the top 20 for sure, and 10 is pretty reasonable.
Yeah, so he's 109th of the all-time money list, and that's against people who put in a lot more volume than him. He has almost 10 million in live tournament earnings, so that definitely is part of what swayed it for me. In general, looking at my list, I really care about versatility, and I don't just mean versatility in one form. I not just live versus online. Like, that's one form of versatility for me, but I care more about versatility of game types. So if you're very competitive at multiple game types, also if you're very competitive at multiple different game formats. So tournaments versus sit and goes versus cash games, right? And then live versus online. Those are things that were really important to me, and I think you can understand in the context of that why I'd have Ike number 2, Dan Cates number 3, and of course Ivy up at top, and even have guys like Scott Seaver, down below.
Doug, I have a question for you about this slide. Where does this Ike rank on your top 5 Ikes? This actually might be the GOAT Ike. Yeah, the long
The
hair
long hair with the
sunglasses.
shades. Ooh.
Oh, so good.
I think that's my favorite Ike.
It really reminds me of when he won that WPT event where they
Yeah.
played it outside and it was just outrageously windy. That's some of my favorite poker content of all time, by the way. It's too funny. All right, with that, thanks for the list, Kane. Let's reveal Doug's top. Doug, you wanna call this out?
Yeah, so Phil Ivey, number one. I thought a lot about number one, and I wanted to do something cool and hip and pick somebody else, but I couldn't. I think that Phil Ivey, overall, when you consider the accolades across all of the years of playing, if you think about how feared he's been, if you think about the online play, the live play, the cash play, the tournament play, the mixed game play, I just think he's done more than anyone has at a top level. And he's done it publicly and privately, and he's done it against some very ferocious competition. I know I've said some things about Ivey where he's not a great player in today's games, and I think that that's true. I don't think that Phil Ivey is the top 5 or 10 in any format today, and unless it's a very soft lineup, he's not the biggest winner. He might not even be a winning player in some of these lineups. But if we just look at overall throughout their career, I just think Ivey's been too consistent in too many forms of poker to not get the nod for number one. Cates, I talked about a bunch earlier. Best hand reader of all time. Great at a ton of different formats. Absolutely a nightmare to play shorthand with. And has a ferocity that I don't see from many of the other players. True Teller, I think two and three were really close to me. If I had to kind of tier these, I would say that I think there's a little bit of a gap from Ivey to tier 2. And then True Teller and Cates are both just right neck and neck for me. Both phenomenal players, good in a variety of forms of poker, good online, good live. If they have to learn a game, they're going to be great at it soon. So I think that they're both neck and neck right there. Then a bit of a gap again. I have to give credit to Ike for the success that he had coming up in the online streets, playing a lot of these same formats. They're very difficult and different than the other two guys. He, I think, transitioned over to live tournaments a little bit more successfully. He's played way more live tournaments in his career, way more winnings, a lot more bullets too. So maybe the ROIs weren't matching up there. It's hard to say with the way that poker tracks winnings online, but just have a lot of respect for what Ike's done over his career. He's beaten a lot of really tough opponents, and he's just become sharp in pretty much all the games that he plays. And if you think about, there's a kind of a theme with, I guess, my list, which is well-rounded and good at basically all of their games, but also able to kind of hang heads up. Like all these top 7, the entire top 7 plays heads up at least somewhat competitively. If not, didn't have times where they were world-class number one at a heads-up format. So I think maybe it's just sort of the way that I view poker, but I have a lot of respect for people willing to put it on the line and fight to become the best at something, particularly in difficult formats versus talented opposition. And this entire list has that. Antonius, a little bit like Ivey in that nowadays he might not be quite up there anymore, but still just a phenomenal player overall if you look at the length of his career. Strelitz, I think, doesn't get nearly the credit that he deserves. Of course, didn't even make the top 20. And then Negreanu is he's a little bit in his own class of player where he's really gotten good over the last year or two. And so now he's very well positioned to make quite the run at becoming the best player ever. I think if the next 10 years Negreanu keeps working like he has been working, and Ivey continues to drop off how he has, I would not be surprised to see Negreanu become viewed as the number one poker player in the world. I'm sure some people view that already, but even within the elite community, would not be surprised to see Negreanu make a run at it. Will he pass people like Cates or True Teller or Haxton? It's kind of hard to say, but one thing that Negreanu has that I think the other guys don't have is that he has a real hunger to play in these public formats, like tournaments, like stream games, in ways that I think maybe the other guys are a bit more based around just making money. And I think that will certainly help Negreanu's case to try and become number one day.
You think Negreanu could be number one on your list, Doug, even if he doesn't branch out into the cash game realm? Because that's one thing that I think Negreanu stands out on your list is he's
how are we going to say
cash games?
I don't think you can say that. I mean, he's played a lot of cash games in the last even few years. He's played a bunch of stream games. He played the match versus me. That was a cash game. He's played all these high stakes poker shows in Vegas.
So let me reframe. He hasn't had a lot of success in the cash games, right? If
Okay.
you're going to use this as a data point.
Fair, but then taking away from that challenge, right? Other than how many people, let me think about how to phrase this exactly. I think Negreanu improved considerably through that challenge to where he can now compete in a lot of these other formats a lot more successfully. And so I think that while he didn't do well in that format, he took on an opponent that was very likely to win and is very good at the format, and he got a lot better there. So I do think that that is a positive and not a negative, even though he lost. I still think that if you look at how he played by the end, he impressed a lot of people with the level that he played at. And I think that taking on challenges like that is what builds your career moving forward to being an elite player. You just can't say that about guys like Ivy or Antonius. I feel like in 10 years, Ivy is not going to be viewed as the consensus number one like he is today. Because let's face it, most people view him as number one because he's just done enough stuff. In 10 years, I do not think Ivy will be number one. And I think that Negreanu plays the types of games that will allow him to move up the list more successfully.
So it sounds like you think longevity is one of the more important factors here. Whereas for me, I believe 10 years from now, if you look at this list, you're still going to be able to say for numbers 1 through 6 that for X period of time, at least X game, but probably X, Y, and Z, they were one of the best cash game players in the world, or one of the most dominant players in the world. And I don't think we're going to be able to say that for Negreanu at any point in his entire career. That at any point in time, he was one of the best players at any format of games in the world, certainly not cash games. But you can say that for every single player on your list, 1 through 6.
Yeah, I guess what Negreanu has going for him more than the rest of the list is that he has been successful in more areas than most of this list. You know, he has obviously more tournament winnings than anyone. And then on the cash game side, I think his no limit game today is at least somewhat competitive, whereas some of these guys I wouldn't say the same. And
the final thing I want to ask you about before we move on is when we did the top 20 the last time, I was pretty high on Kate's, and you said that you were a little bit surprised by that. And now Kate's has made it into your second spot. Have you changed some of your opinions throughout this, or what has this process been like for you in order to come up with this list?
You know, Kane, it's been 3 weeks. Actually, it's been more like 4 or 5 weeks because I got sick for a week in there too, and we had a week off of just talking to people about top players on endlessly. And so I've heard so many opinions from so many players that it's kind of refined the way that I view some players positively and some negatively. And it's also made me think what really defines someone as great. And the more that I think about that, the more I felt like Jungle is just a truly great poker player. I felt like at first I thought he was a little one-dimensional, but then I actually think that's not true given how much live he's played, given the fact he has played some more tournaments nowadays, given the fact that he's been successful in a lot of different game types. But I think that one of the main caveats for people in my top 5 is a propensity to take on tough opponents, learn, improve, become better, and then just be really tough to deal with, where it's extremely hard to find exploits and beat them with that. And certainly the top 4 are like that. I think Jungle, Truteller, and Ike are all a little similar to me. They came similar-ish times online, really good online at formats, but I think there's a bit of a theme on my list as well.
Yeah, the final theme on your list is I think if we ask you about your favorite basketball players, Chamberlain wouldn't be on the list, or the best baseball players, Ruth wouldn't be on the list. And not much respect for the old school guys, Doug.
Don't ask Doug about his favorite baseball players or the best baseball players. That's a wasted conversation.
I just don't think that the older generation, given how much less competitive it was in terms of the volume of people playing, that's just true. Poker blew up in the early 2000s. I think that we have to accept not the level of play, because obviously software has pushed us into a new era, but we have to accept that if there's a tremendous less number of players playing, there's a fraction of players playing, then the people that rise to the top of that, it's just less impressive than a way bigger group of players. And I think the poker boom, there might be 10, 15x the players that play post poker boom as pre poker boom. Maybe it's 5x, but it's 5 to 15x or more. So when I look at the older generation, in order to put these people in my top 5 or 10, and they probably crack the top 10 here if I had to list them out further, I really need to see some real dominance that indicates to me that, yeah, you were the best for sure in that era, even though it was less competitive. But I don't. I see Chip Reese, who's probably the closest thing to that. I see Doyle, who had many, many years of winning. Maybe he won the most money, but I'm not rating very highly beating people in the 60s in small private games without much competition. I'm just not. You know what that kind of feels like to me, Kane? It's sort of similar to Blazarian beating some fish heads up 50 million. Did it happen? Yeah. Is it going to make me view Blazarian as a top 5 player? And I'm not trying to say Doyle and Blazarian are the same. Obviously, there's a big difference between those two. But those kinds of victories, right? I just don't see enough dominance.
I think we strongly disagree on this point. It's like saying that baseball was not competitive in the 40s or basketball was not competitive in the 50s. We weren't there, right? And I just have to assume that when people were putting up literally millions of dollars, which in today's inflation adjusted terms is $5 million or $10 million in cash games, that they were trying pretty goddamn hard. And
but
that
Kane, was there a baseball boom in the 60s? No. And that's the difference here. The difference that we're talking about is when 10x the number of people start playing a game, then the level that it takes to be at the top of that is fundamentally different. Not because they played in the olden days, but because now there is just a tremendously larger player. I keep wanting the word tremendously here. There's a much larger player pool that makes it much more difficult to get to the top echelon.
No, I agree with you on that point. And
Viewing it
from that lens, it does make sense. Viewing it from that lens, it does make sense for you to require a standard that is, this guy needs to be the consensus GOAT from back in the day in order for that person to crack the top. But what I don't think is the case is that guys like Doyle or Chip could just roll out of bed and do what they did. I think it was a very, very difficult thing to do. And there were other guys who we talked about earlier, like Puggy Pearson, or, even a little bit later, Seidel, who were trying to do that as well, right? And it's not just like it was easy money all over the place. These people were thinking about poker. They were trying to be good at poker. They didn't have the tools that we have today. And so to me, I almost respect what it took to be good at poker back then a little bit more than what it takes to be good at poker today. I respect that skill set a little bit more, of needing to figure it out on the fly without having the information, rather than just, put in 60 hours a week of studying sims. But I will say that today there is so much more competition that, you are competing against a larger pool, and it's tougher to do that.
I'm not trying to downplay the success of people in the past era, or that they wouldn't be successful in today's day. It just, when there are so many less players, you have to view it differently.
I think it's pretty simple. The threshold for dominance goes up when there are fewer players. If you want to be if you want to be considered like one of the greatest, a super dominant player, these days all you have to do is be good, amazing at one format, right? But if you want to be considered the same, in the 60s or 70s, you had to really be just whacking everyone at every game type in every tournament for the most part. And I think Doug's point is no one satisfies that criteria. My pushback on that would basically be, we don't really know, because it's just hard to know exactly what was going on, and that's what makes it so.
Well, we do
tricky.
kind of know, Brady, because, for example, Reese didn't play a ton of tournaments, right? He wasn't a very successful tournament player, so we don't see the dominance like across those two forms. So the closest thing kind of is Doyle. I think.
Right, but it's just so hard to know what was going on in the cash games. Like the best we can do is like what Kane did, talk to a poker historian
Sure.
and try to get some anecdotes essentially. But it's just so difficult. I think we've spent a good amount of time here, and it is finally time to reveal the top 20 fan vote. So keep in mind, this was a vote of the 20 who were voted in last week. So there's no parentheses in this list. This is the fan vote, ranked choice voting style of the 20 that had made the cut last week. So with that, drum roll in your head, please. Boom, there it is. And I'll read it down.
I'm at the top of the list, Brady.
Yep, just the right side of it. So we got Phil Ivey at number 1, Dale Negreanu at number 2, Doyle Brunson at number 3, Phil Hellmuth at number 4. Ooh, chat's gonna love that. Linus at number 5, Dan Cates at number 6, Stu Unger at number 7, Phil Galfond at number 8, Tom Dwan at number 9, Chip Reese at number 10. Moving on to 11 through 20 now. Doug at number 11, Eric Seidel at number 12, Isaac Haxton at number 13, Victor Blum at number 14, Fedor Hulse at number 15, Patrick Antonius at number 16, Justin Bonomo at 17, 18 is Stephen Chidwick, 19 is Jason Koon, and coming in last of that list is Jonathan Chan.
This is
So-
a couple things really surprise me about this list. I guess I'll start by talking about what offends me rather than surprises me. Numbers 7, 13, and 16 all offend me.
Yeah. Ike is too low.
Ike being 13th on this list is crazy
I think
to me.
More importantly, yeah, it's who he's in relation to the other players, right? Like, how can you have Stu Unger in front of some of these guys?
Kane, what do you think? Should we have public elections anymore? What are your thoughts?
Well,
hard to argue that we should, right?
I think they got number 1 right.
I think they got number 1 right. I think that okay, so just first off, surprises. The surprising things here to me are Linus at 5 is shocking. I actually just can't believe that he's that high. Stu at 7 is it's not really shocking because people seem to really love Stu. But it feels wrong, but slightly shocking maybe. Tom Dwan being 9th. I'm actually a little bit impressed they didn't put him higher.
Yeah, me too.
But being that he shouldn't be in the top 20, I think that they did a good job of just reeling it in a little bit and putting him at 9th. Chip Reese at 10 seems fairly reasonable. I feel like I don't think I would be 11th if I made my own list. I don't think I'd put myself that high. But at least it didn't become, this is my podcast, people are voting me. Or maybe it did. But I think we did a good job of trying to prevent that. Seidel at 12. The thing about Seidel was kind of interesting. I didn't see one Seidel vote out of anyone that we asked.
Yeah.
So
that is
bit of a disconnect between how I felt about Seidel in tournaments versus what I think the high roller scene seems to think. So maybe pretty reasonable. Yeah, Ike at 13, definitely a pretty huge snub. Victor at 14. I mean, what are we doing here? Victor is coming in over Fedor. Well, pretty outrageous. And then I think everything else you could beat is pretty reasonable.
I think it's kind of easy to figure out why this list is this way, right? I mean, we have, if you look at the top 10 and all of the top 4, it's quite dominated by players who have been around since like roughly 2003, have really been in the spotlight a lot. Linus is an interesting inclusion at number 5, but him and Dan Cates, I mean, it's not exactly the same because Dan has played a lot of live, but Linus, in my experience and like sort of how the poker world, the fans like look at things these days, Linus has this allure around him right now, very similar to the allure that OTB had like 4 years ago. I think that's why he sort of cracks into this top 10 and kind of is he doesn't really fit with the rest of this list, right? I mean, he's the only like really like online grinder, kind of exclusive online grinder there. And then the other ones, it really comes down to the people who have the most visibility for the most part, and that's who tended to win. But they did get number 1 right, and that's really nice.
I wish I could give my spot to True Teller so that it could still be a huge snub.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, first of all, to be fair to you, among these 20 players, I had you at number 11 personally, myself. I honestly think the most surprising thing to me about this list is 16. Like, to me, Patrick is one of the big name televised pros. He has a, much bigger name than some of the people who are in front of him on this list, such as Galfond among the mainstream, or certainly Linus. And also Patrick is somebody who I believe deserves to be in the top 10 overall, although I'd say it's close. I wouldn't say that somebody's wrong to not put Patrick in the top 10 overall, but on this list, I think Patrick should definitely be in the top 10, and I'm surprised that he wasn't, just based on his name record.
I think there, Kane, it's what have you done for me lately?
Yeah, that would be my hypothesis too. Like, if you look at all these other guys that made it, I mean, with the exception of Stu Unger, and Chip, they've all sort of kept in the spotlight in some way, whereas Patrick really has fallen off. He hasn't really been talked about in poker much. I mean, there was just like a Finnish documentary made about him. That's about the biggest splash Patrick has made in a while in the
What about Doyle?
Press. I mean, he returned and played the World Series last year, and that got a bunch of press. And I don't know. I feel like he's still like tweeting and stuff. Like, he's still top of people's mind in some way, And I also think there's an element of Doyle had a lot more longevity before that than
Patrick literally launched his own poker series, the Patrick Antonius Poker Challenge.
Oh yeah, he did do that recently. That's
yeah. How popular has that been?
Hey, I broadcast for that, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So very popular, very, very popular.
The only other thing I guess we should talk a little bit about is number 20. A couple of people I spoke to had Chan like after Doyle and Reese, but in that conversation of like one of the old school best. And so for me, among these 20 players, I think I had Chan at like 14 or something, because there was a period of time where Chan was pretty dominant and was considered somebody you definitely didn't want to play at many forms of poker. And then if you want to look at results, right? Like, to me, it's a little bit strange to have Hellmuth at 4, who never had that dominance factor in cash games, like outside of tournaments, but to have Chan at number 20. I do have Hellmuth as a little bit higher than Chan on my list, but it's only a little bit higher, right? But here there's like a stark contrast there.
Having Hellmuth next to Linus is great. The contrast, right? The contrast between those two players is fantastic. And then to go Cates and Unger next to each other as well. Both great.
We need a Hellmuth versus Linus televised NBC sit and go.
I guess if it's a sit and go, I know who the favorite is. Still Linus. All right, guys. I want to wrap it up here. I want to say thank you to Mike and Kane. You guys were awesome in this process. You really helped add some color. And Kane, thank you for all of the insights that you had over the last couple eps.
Yeah, super helpful.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, I've really enjoyed being a part of it.
Very nice.
I appreciated being here. Did not appreciate reading some of the chat's thoughts, because it just it's rough. But some of you are great, and I love having a chat with Doug and Kane, so I was glad to be here overall.
Glad to hear it, Mike. And thank you guys for tuning in at home for this series. That's the conclusion. Ivy takes it down. We're going to be back next week. Gary Blackwood joins the podcast. Looking forward to it. I'll see you then. Oh, and guys, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe. Got a lot more podcasts coming your way. See you soon.